When Javier Rivas handed his assistant a golden-edged invitation to the firm's most exclusive gala in front of 20 smirking lawyers and his girlfriend's ice-cold smile, he thought he was delivering the perfect humiliation. Nora Vale stood there in her discount blazer, silent as glass, while Camila de la Vega whispered just loud enough for everyone to hear. She'll probably show up in polyester. But what none of them knew, what Javier couldn't possibly have guessed, was that the woman fetching his coffee every morning had once commanded boardrooms in 3 languages, had walked halls of power they'd never touch, and was about to show them all exactly what quiet dignity looked like when it finally chose to speak. If you want to see how this story unfolds, stay with me until the end. And please, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The 63rd floor of Hartwell & Stone LLP offered a view that made people believe in their own importance. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan stretched out like a kingdom built of glass and ambition, and the lawyers who worked there had long ago stopped seeing it as a city and started seeing it as a scoreboard. They were winning. They had always been winning, and they made damn sure everyone knew it. Javier Rivas stood at the head of the conference table that Wednesday afternoon, his Tom Ford suit fitting him the way power was supposed to, effortlessly, inevitably. At 34, he'd made senior associate faster than anyone in the firm's history, and he wore that achievement like armor. Dark hair perfectly styled, jawline sharp enough to cut contracts, the kind of face that made clients trust him with their fortunes and colleagues watch their backs around him. He was presenting this Nakamura deal. 8 months of negotiations, $200 million in mergers and acquisitions, the kind of win that made careers. His voice carried that particular confidence that came from never having been truly challenged, from growing up in Connecticut, boarding schools where his last name opened doors before he even had to knock. "The Japanese delegation arrives in 6 weeks, Javier said, his laser pointer dancing across projected financials. "We close this, and Hartwell & Stone becomes the go-to firm for Pacific Rim corporate restructuring. We're not just talking about a deal, we're talking about positioning." Around the table, senior partners nodded. Richard Hartwell, silver-haired and sharp-eyed at 62, smiled like a shark scenting blood in the water. Margaret Chen, who'd made partner by outworking everyone and outthinking most, scribbled notes with the intensity of someone who treated every meeting like warfare. And then there was Camila de la Vega. She sat 3 seats down from Javier, perfectly positioned to be in his sightline without seeming to demand attention. At 31, Camila had the kind of beauty that required maintenance. Personal trainers at 5 a.m., dermatologists on speed dial, a wardrobe that cost more than most people's cars. Her father owned half the commercial real estate in Miami, and she'd been groomed since birth to marry someone who would expand that empire, not diminish it. Javier Rivas, with his Harvard Law degree and his partnership track, and his complete inability to see past surfaces, had seemed like the perfect choice. "Excellent work, Javier," Richard Hartwell said, closing his leather portfolio with a decisive snap. "This is exactly the kind of aggressive positioning that separates us from the second-tier firms. Margaret, your team ready on the due diligence side?" "Completely," Margaret replied. "We've been working nights for 3 weeks. Every document translated, every regulatory filing cross-referenced with Tokyo standards. We're airtight." Javier nodded, allowing himself a small smile. This was the moment he lived for, the recognition, the respect, the unspoken acknowledgement that he was exactly where he deserved to be. "Actually," Camilla said, her voice sliding into the conversation like silk over steel, "I think we should talk about the gala." The room's energy shifted subtly. The firm's annual charity gala was less about charity and more about spectacle. A $2,000 a plate dinner at the Metropolitan Club where Manhattan's legal elite gathered to remind each other of their status. It was the kind of event where deals were made in whispered conversations between courses, where partnerships were forged over vintage wine, where the right introduction could change a career trajectory overnight. "The invitations went out last week," Margaret said. "Is there a problem?" Camilla's smile was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to seem genuine, cool enough to convey control. "Not a problem, more of an observation. I was looking at the guest list and I noticed we're very insular this year, all the usual faces. I thought perhaps we should expand our circle a bit." Richard Hartwell raised an eyebrow. You have someone in mind? Well, Camilla said, and her eyes found Javier's with practiced timing. I was thinking about inclusivity, about making sure everyone feels valued, about extending invitations to people who might not typically get invited to events like this. Javier felt the trap closing before he understood its architecture. Camilla had been dropping hints for weeks about the firm's image problem, about how they needed to be more accessible, more diverse. He'd nodded along, assuming she was talking about optics, about the kind of corporate social responsibility that looked good in promotional materials. He hadn't realized she was building toward this moment. For instance, Camilla continued, her voice rising just enough to ensure everyone was listening, what about Nora, our assistant? She works so hard, always here late, always so dedicated. Wouldn't it be a nice gesture to invite her to the gala? Show her that her contributions are appreciated? The conference room went very, very quiet. Nora Vale had worked at Hartwell and Stone for 14 months, and in that time she'd become functionally invisible. She was the person who made sure Javier's coffee was exactly right. Black, no sugar, hot enough to drink, but not scalding. She was the one who organized his files with a precision that made his life easier without him ever having to acknowledge the work involved. She answered phones, managed schedules, printed documents, and performed all the small, essential tasks that kept the machinery of power running smoothly. She was also, and everyone in that room knew this, someone they never thought about unless she made a mistake. Javier felt the weight of 20 pairs of eyes settling on him. The moment stretched out, loaded with social dynamics he was only beginning to understand. If he said no, he'd look cruel. If he said yes and Nora declined, he'd look foolish. If he said yes and she accepted, he thought about Nora as he'd seen her that morning, plain navy dress, sensible shoes, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She was competent, certainly, professional. But trying to imagine her at the Metropolitan Club Gala, surrounded by Manhattan's legal royalty in their designer gowns and custom tuxedos, was like trying to picture a sparrow at a gathering of eagles. It would be awkward for everyone, especially her. That's actually a lovely idea, Javier heard himself say, his voice carrying across the room with that easy confidence that had always served him well. Very thoughtful, Camilla. We should absolutely extend an invitation to Nora. Several of the younger associates exchanged glances. Margaret Chen's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind her eyes. Disapproval, maybe? Or recognition of a game being played that she wanted no part of. Camilla's smile widened. Wonderful. Why don't you tell her after the meeting? I'm sure she'll be so surprised. The meeting wrapped up 10 minutes later. Partners filtered out, discussing the Nakamura deal and quarterly projections and which sommelier they were using for the gala. Javier gathered his materials, feeling a small knot of unease in his chest that he couldn't quite name. Camilla appeared at his elbow, her perfume, something French and expensive, enveloping him. That was sweet of you, she murmured, low enough that only he could hear, giving the help a little thrill. She'll probably talk about it for years. You think she'll actually come? Javier asked. Camilla laughed, a sound like champagne bubbles. God, I hope so. Can you imagine? It'll be like that scene in every makeover movie where the nerdy girl shows up to prom and everyone pretends not to notice how out of place she is. Although honestly, I'm betting she'll make some excuse. Save herself the embarrassment. Javier looked at his girlfriend. At the perfect angles of her face, the calculated elegance of her posture, the absolute certainty in her eyes that the world was divided into people who mattered and people who didn't. He'd been attracted to that certainty once. It had seemed like strength. Now, just for a moment, it looked like something else. I should go talk to her, he said. Of course, Camilla said, kissing his cheek with practiced affection. I'll see you tonight. We're still on for Nobu, right? 8 o'clock, Javier confirmed. He found Nora at her desk in the administrative bullpen, a cluster of cubicles where the firm's support staff worked in efficient semi-isolation. She was typing something, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the kind of unconscious competence that came from doing the same task thousands of times. She looked up when he approached, and for just a second, Javier really looked at her, not as a function, not as the assistant, but as an actual person. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe 28 or 29. Pale skin, dark hair that caught the fluorescent light in shades of auburn, gray eyes that were oddly steady, oddly calm. Nora, he said, pulling out what he hoped was a warm, inclusive smile. Do you have a minute? She saved her document and turned to face him fully, her posture attentive but not subservient. Of course. What do you need? For some reason, that phrasing, what do you need, not how can I help you, caught him off guard. It was subtle, but it suggested a different kind of relationship than he'd assumed existed between them. So, the firm's annual gala is coming up, Javier said, leaning against the edge of her cubicle with calculated casualness. It's at the Metropolitan Club, very fancy, very exclusive, usually just partners and senior associates. But this year we thought it would be nice to extend invitations to some of our exceptional support staff, people who really keep this place running. Nora's expression didn't change. She waited, those gray eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made him oddly self-conscious. Anyway, Javier continued, pulling the spare invitation from his jacket pocket. Camila had given it to him, he realized now, which meant she'd planned this whole thing. We'd like to invite you, as our guest, a way of saying thank you for all your hard work. He held out the invitation, thick cream cardstock with gold embossing, the kind of invitation that announced its own importance. Nora took it, her fingers careful on the expensive paper. She looked at it for a long moment, long enough that Javier started to feel uncomfortable. This Saturday, she said quietly, reading the details. 8 p.m. Black tie. Right, Javier said. I mean, you don't have to come if you don't want to. No pressure. But we thought you might enjoy it. Great food, great music, chance to see how the other half lives, you know? As soon as the words left his mouth, he winced internally. How the other half lives. Jesus. That sounded patronizing even to his own ears. But Nora just looked up at him, her expression still calm, still unreadable. That's very kind, she said. Thank you for thinking of me. So you'll come? Javier asked, surprised by how much he suddenly wanted her to decline, to save both of them from whatever awkwardness Saturday night would bring. I'll consider it, Nora said, setting the invitation carefully on her desk. Was there anything else? Javier blinked. In his world, an invitation to the firm's gala was the social equivalent of a summons from royalty. People didn't consider it. They accepted immediately, gratefully, knowing what an honor it represented. No, he said slowly. That's all. Just, let me know. If you decide to come. I will, Nora said, and turned back to her computer, her fingers already moving across the keyboard again, as if the entire conversation had been a minor interruption in her actual work. Javier walked back to his office feeling strangely off balance. He told himself it was nothing, just a moment of awkwardness in an otherwise successful day. The Nakamura deal was proceeding perfectly. The partners respected him. Camila was waiting for him at Nobu with that smile that promised things would make sense again. But that night, as he sat across from his girlfriend in the restaurant's ambient lighting, watching her photograph her omakase selection for Instagram, he found himself thinking about the way Nora had looked at him, steady, calm, almost pitying. Like she knew something he didn't, like she was waiting for him to figure it out. By Thursday morning, the entire firm knew about the invitation. These things had a way of traveling through office hierarchies faster than email, spreading through whispered conversations and knowing looks, until everyone from the mailroom to the corner offices had heard some version of the story. Most versions painted Javier as magnanimous, Camila as thoughtful, and Nora as the lucky recipient of unexpected generosity. A few of the older secretaries, women who'd worked at Hartwell and Stone long enough to recognize power games when they saw them, exchanged glances that said something different, but they kept their thoughts to themselves. That was how you survived in places like this. Nora went about her work with the same quiet efficiency she always demonstrated. She organized Javier's case files for the Nakamura negotiations. She scheduled his meetings. She made sure his coffee was exactly right, always, without him having to ask. And she didn't mention the invitation once. Friday afternoon, as most of the office began their weekend exodus, partners heading to Hampton's houses, associates heading to expensive bars to complain about partners, Camila appeared in the administrative bullpen. She rarely came to this part of the floor. Why would she? Everything she needed, people brought to her. But today she walked straight to Nora's cubicle, her heels clicking on the industrial carpet with percussive authority. Nora, she said, her voice carrying that particular warmth wealthy people used when they wanted to seem gracious, I wanted to check in about tomorrow night. Are you planning to join us? Nora looked up from her computer. Several other administrative assistants had gone very still, pretending to work while listening to every word. I haven't decided yet, Nora said quietly. Camilla's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Oh, well, I hope you do come. It would be such a shame to miss it, though I completely understand if you're not comfortable with that kind of event. Not everyone is used to that level of formality. Formality doesn't intimidate me, Nora said, her voice still quiet but somehow firmer, like steel wrapped in velvet. Of course not, Camilla said quickly. I just meant, well, the dress code is quite specific. Black tie, which usually means gowns, designer labels, that sort of thing. I'm wearing Valentino custom. I just wouldn't want you to feel out of place if you couldn't find something appropriate. The other women in the bullpen had stopped even pretending to work. This was a masterclass in upper-class cruelty, and they were watching it unfold with the horrified fascination of people witnessing a car accident. Nora stood up slowly. She was shorter than Camilla, most people were, but somehow, rising to her full height, she seemed to occupy more space than her physical form suggested. I appreciate your concern, Nora said, meeting Camilla's eyes with that same unsettling steadiness. If I decide to attend, I'll make sure to dress appropriately. I do own clothes that aren't from Target. It was the first time anyone had heard Nora push back, even gently, and the effect on Camilla was immediate. Her cheeks flushed, not with embarrassment, but with anger at being challenged by someone so far beneath her social station. I'm sure you do, Camilla said, her voice losing its warmth entirely. I was just trying to be helpful, but clearly you have everything under control. She turned and walked away, her exit somehow managing to convey both dismissal and displeasure. The moment she was gone, Rosa Martinez, a paralegal who'd been at the firm for 15 years, leaned over the cubicle wall. Girl, she whispered, you just made an enemy. Nora sat back down, her expression unchanged. I made an enemy the moment Javier Rivas handed me that invitation, she said quietly. This was always going to happen. Rosa studied her for a long moment. You're different than I thought, she said finally. Quieter, but not weaker. I like that. Thanks, Nora said, and returned to her work, leaving the question of her attendance at the gala still, deliberately, unanswered. Yet, Saturday evening arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that made Manhattan feel like the center of the universe. The sky was deep blue going to purple, the air cool enough for elegant wraps, but not cold enough to ruin careful hairstyling. The Metropolitan Club stood on Fifth Avenue like a monument to old money, its limestone facade glowing in the early evening light. Javier arrived early because Camilla insisted on making an entrance, and making an entrance required planning. She looked spectacular. Her Valentino gown was midnight blue, cut to emphasize every expensive curve, her dark hair swept up to show off diamond earrings that cost more than Nora probably made in 6 months. You look incredible, Javier said, and meant it. Camilla was objectively beautiful, the kind of beautiful that made other women study her with envy and calculation. Thank you, baby, she said, kissing him carefully so as not to disturb her lipstick. You look very handsome. Is that the Brioni? The Brioni, he confirmed. They entered together, and the evening began its choreographed dance. Partners greeted them with firm handshakes and air kisses. Associates clustered around the bar, drinking expensive whiskey and pretending they weren't networking desperately. Clients mingled with lawyers, everyone performing the elaborate social theater that justified the ticket price. Richard Hartwell found Javier 20 minutes in, a glass of scotch in his hand and approval in his eyes. Good turnout, he said. The Nakamura team sent flowers. Very respectful gesture. They're taking this seriously. We all are, Javier replied. This deal is going to redefine our Pacific Rim presence. Agreed. And speaking of presence, Richard said, his eyes scanning the room, I heard you extended an invitation to your assistant. Bold move. Diversity optics are important, but you have to be careful not to make people uncomfortable. Something in Javier bristled at that. The casual assumption that Nora's presence would make people uncomfortable. The easy equation of diversity with problem to be managed. But he swallowed the reaction, smiled, and said what was expected. "I don't think she's coming," he said. "Probably realized it wasn't her scene." "Probably for the best," Richard agreed. "Kind gesture, though. Shows you're thinking about team morale." The conversation moved on to other topics: quarterly earnings, lateral hiring, the new bankruptcy practice they were building. Javier nodded in the right places, laughed at the right jokes, and tried to ignore the small voice in his head that sounded uncomfortably like disappointment. He'd halfway hoped Nora would surprise him. The Metropolitan Club's main ballroom was a study in Gilded Age excess. Crystal chandeliers that could have funded college educations, marble floors polished to mirror brightness, walls covered in dark wood paneling that whispered of robber barons and railroad fortunes. The firm had rented the entire space, 300 guests moving through rooms designed to make rich people feel significant. Dinner was announced at 8:30. People began migrating toward the main dining room, conversations flowing like expensive wine, laughter pitched at the perfect volume to suggest enjoyment without implying loss of control. That's when the energy in the room changed. It was subtle at first, a few heads turning toward the entrance, conversations pausing mid-sentence, the kind of ripple effect that happened when something unexpected disrupted established patterns. Javier turned to see what had captured everyone's attention, and there was Nora Vale. She stood in the ballroom entrance like she'd been carved from confidence itself, wearing a dress that made Camilla's custom Valentino look like it was trying too hard. Deep crimson silk, simple in construction but perfect in execution, the kind of dress that cost either $20,000 or required impeccable taste and a talented seamstress. Her dark hair was down, falling in waves that caught the chandelier light. No excessive jewelry, just small diamond studs that might have been real or might have been costume. But somehow it didn't matter because they were exactly right. But it wasn't the dress or the hair or the understated elegance that stopped conversations mid-word. It was the way she moved. Nora walked into that room, a room full of people who'd spent their entire lives believing they belonged in places exactly like this. And she didn't hesitate, didn't falter, didn't scan the crowd looking for approval or acceptance. She moved like someone who'd walked through rooms like this hundreds of times, like the marble floors and crystal chandeliers were background noise to someone who'd seen palaces and parliaments and places where real power lived. She moved like she belonged there, not because someone had invited her, but because she'd chosen to attend. Beside Javier, Camilla had gone very, very still. "What the hell?" she whispered, and the shock in her voice was so raw, so unfiltered, that several people nearby turned to look. Nora's eyes found Javier's across the room, gray eyes that held something between amusement and challenge, and she smiled. Not a grateful smile, not a nervous smile, just a smile that acknowledged his presence and then moved past it, like he was part of the scenery but not the main event. Margaret Chen materialized beside her almost immediately, and Javier watched in something close to shock as the senior partner, a woman who rarely smiled and never socialized, said something that made Nora laugh, a real laugh, warm and genuine. "How does she know Margaret?" Camilla hissed. "I don't know," Javier said honestly, but he was about to find out. The conversation around Nora and Margaret Chen had drawn a small crowd. The kind of casual clustering that happened at events like this when people sensed something interesting happening but didn't want to appear too eager. Javier found himself drifting closer, Camilla's hand tight on his arm, her nails digging in just enough to communicate displeasure without leaving marks. "I didn't realize you two knew each other," Richard Hartwell was saying, his tone carrying genuine curiosity rather than the polite interest he usually deployed at these functions. Margaret's smile was subtle but real. "We met years ago, actually, a conference in Geneva on international development law. Nora was presenting on sustainable literacy initiatives in emerging markets." Brilliant work. Truly innovative approach to educational infrastructure. Javier felt the ground shift beneath his expensive shoes. Geneva. International development law. Those weren't words that belonged in the same sentence as "my assistant" or "the woman who makes my coffee." "You presented at a conference?" The words came out before he could stop them, and he heard how they sounded, dismissive, disbelieving, almost accusatory. Nora turned to look at him, and her expression was patient in a way that made him feel like a child who'd interrupted adult conversation. "I did a lot of things before I came to Hartwell and Stone," she said quietly. "We all have histories, don't we?" "What kind of work were you doing?" Camilla asked, and her voice had gone sharp, stripped of its usual practiced warmth. Before you became an assistant, I mean. Various projects, Nora said, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter with a small nod of thanks. Consulting work, mostly. Program development, strategic planning for nonprofit organizations. Nothing particularly glamorous. Nora is being modest, Margaret interjected. She helped build one of the most successful adult literacy programs in Eastern Europe, got funding from 3 different EU agencies, coordinated implementation across 6 countries. The World Bank cited her model as best practice in their 2019 development report. The small crowd around them had grown larger. Young associates leaned in, pretending to examine the hors d'oeuvres while actually listening to every word. Senior partners exchanged glances that communicated wordless questions, and Camilla had gone very, very pale beneath her expertly applied makeup. That's fascinating, Richard Hartwell said slowly, and Javier could practically see the man's strategic mind working, recalculating, reassessing. Why on earth are you working as an administrative assistant? Nora's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in those gray eyes. Something that might have been pain, or might have been anger, or might have been both. Sometimes we need to step back and regroup, she said. Life doesn't always move in straight lines. I needed stability for a while, and Hartwell and Stone provided that. But surely someone with your qualifications, Margaret began, then stopped, seeming to realize the implications of what she was saying. That someone with Nora's background was wildly overqualified for her current position. That the firm had somehow failed to recognize what they had. That they'd wasted talent out of sheer blindness. Before anyone could respond, a ripple of excitement moved through the ballroom. Heads turned toward the entrance, and Javier heard someone whisper, "Is that actually him?" Etienne Marceau entered the Metropolitan Club like he owned it, which in some cosmic sense he probably did. The legendary European investor was in his 70s but moved with the energy of a much younger man. His white hair swept back from a face that radiated intelligence and calculated charm. He'd built a fortune investing in emerging markets, funded 3 presidential campaigns across 2 continents, and had a reputation for being able to spot talent and opportunity where others saw only risk. He was also, according to the whispered conversations now filling the ballroom, almost impossible to get an audience with. The fact that he'd shown up at a law firm charity gala was remarkable. The fact that he was scanning the room with obvious purpose was unprecedented. And then Etienne Marceau's eyes found Nora Vale, and his entire face transformed with genuine delight. "Nora!" His voice carried across the ballroom with the authority of someone who'd spent decades commanding attention. "My dear girl, I heard you were in New York, but I hardly dared hope I'd find you here." Javier watched, stunned, as Nora's professional composure melted into something warmer, more human. She set down her champagne glass and moved to meet Marceau, and the older man took both her hands in his with obvious affection. "Monsieur Marceau," she said, and her voice had changed too, still quiet, but carrying a warmth Javier had never heard in their daily interactions. "This is a lovely surprise. I didn't know you were in the city." "I arrived yesterday," Marceau said, still holding her hands, his eyes bright with what looked like genuine fondness. "A board meeting that could have been an email, as you Americans say. But if it brought me to this moment, perhaps it was worthwhile after all. How are you truly? You disappeared after Prague, and none of us could find you." "I needed some time," Nora said softly, "to figure out what came next." "And have you figured it out?" Marceau asked, his voice gentle but probing. "I'm working on it," Nora replied. Marceau finally released her hands, but his attention remained focused entirely on her, as if the 300 other people in the ballroom had ceased to exist. "The literacy program you built," he said. "It's still running, still changing lives. The Czech Republic just adopted your model for their rural education initiative. They wanted me to find you, to ask if you'd consult." "I'm honored," Nora said, and Javier could hear real emotion in her voice now. "That work meant everything to me." "It showed," Marceau said. "You had something rare, Nora. Vision combined with practical implementation skills. Most people have one or the other. You had both." He paused, seeming to notice for the first time the crowd of lawyers watching their conversation with varying degrees of shock and fascination. "Where are you working now?" Please tell me someone has been smart enough to utilize your talents properly. The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to drop. Nora's eyes found Javier's across the small distance separating them, and in that moment, he saw something in her expression he'd never seen before. A kind of sad amusement, like she was watching a play where everyone knew the ending except the actors still stumbling through their lines. "I'm with Hartwell and Stone," she said simply. "The firm hosting this lovely event." "Excellent," Marceau said, brightening. "What's your role? Strategic consulting? International development practice? I know several firms have been building out their nonprofit advisory services." The silence that followed was excruciating. Margaret Chen looked at her shoes. Richard Hartwell took a sudden interest in his scotch. Several junior associates found reasons to drift away, unwilling to witness what came next. "I'm an administrative assistant," Nora said, her voice clear and calm and completely devoid of shame. Etienne Marceau's expression went through several rapid transformations: confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked like anger on someone else's behalf. "You're a what?" "I assist several of the senior associates," Nora continued, still calm, still composed. "Schedule management, document preparation, general administrative support. It's honest work." "It's a waste," Marceau said bluntly, and his voice had gone cold in a way that made several nearby lawyers take involuntary steps backward. "You built programs that educated thousands of people, that influenced international policy, that created sustainable models for social change. And someone at this firm thought the best use of your time was scheduling meetings?" "To be fair," Nora said gently, "I didn't share my background when I applied. I just needed a job, and they needed an assistant. No one did anything wrong." But Marceau was looking at the lawyers surrounding them with the kind of disdain that came from a lifetime of watching mediocre people fail to recognize excellence when it stood right in front of them. "Didn't share your background," he repeated. "So no one thought to ask? No one bothered to look beyond the resume? No one wondered why someone so clearly intelligent and competent was applying for entry-level positions?" Javier felt heat rising in his face, because Marceau was right. He'd never asked Nora about her background, her education, her previous work. He'd never bothered to see her as anything other than a function, a role, a person who existed to make his professional life easier. He'd given her an invitation to this gala as a joke, as a gesture meant to highlight her otherness, her not belonging. And she'd walked in wearing confidence like armor and revealed that she'd belonged in rooms like this long before he'd ever passed the bar exam. Camilla's hand had tightened on his arm so hard he could feel her nails breaking skin through his shirt. When he glanced at her, her face was a mask of barely controlled fury, not at Marceau, not at the situation, but at Nora herself, for having the audacity to be more than she was supposed to be, for disrupting the careful social hierarchy that people like Camilla had spent their entire lives constructing and maintaining. "Well," Richard Hartwell said, clearly trying to salvage something from the rapidly deteriorating situation, "we're always looking to better utilize our talent. Perhaps we should discuss Nora's background in more detail on Monday, see if there might be a better fit within the firm." "Perhaps you should," Marceau said, his tone suggesting he thought this was far too little, far too late. A young man in a dark suit appeared at Marceau's elbow, whispered something urgent, and the investor nodded. "I'm afraid I'm being summoned," he said, his voice warming again as he turned back to Nora. "But please, let's have coffee this week. I'm at the St. Regis through Friday. I'd love to catch up properly, and there are people who would very much like to hear from you." "I'd like that," Nora said, and they exchanged information with the easy familiarity of people who'd maintained real connection across years and distances. As Marceau departed, trailing assistants and hangers-on, the crowd around Nora began to disperse. But the energy in the ballroom had fundamentally changed. Conversations that had been flowing naturally now felt stilted, forced. People kept glancing toward Nora, reassessing, recalibrating. Javier realized with uncomfortable clarity that his assistant, the woman he'd invited to this event as what Camilla had explicitly called a joke, was now the most interesting person in the room, and he had no idea what to do about it. Margaret Chen touched Nora's elbow gently. "I need to speak with some clients," she said quietly, "but let's have lunch next week. I think we have a lot to discuss." "I'd appreciate that," Nora said. As Margaret walked away, Javier found himself moving closer, drawn by some impulse he couldn't quite name. Camilla came with him, still attached to his arm like a beautiful, furious barnacle. "That was quite an entrance," Camilla said, and her smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "You certainly made an impression, though I have to wonder if ambushing everyone with your secret impressive background was really the most professional approach." Nora turned to look at her, and her expression was so patient, so genuinely unbothered, that it made Camilla's aggression look petty and small. "I didn't ambush anyone," she said quietly. "I accepted an invitation to attend an event. That's all." "But you knew," Camilla pressed. "You knew no one here knew about your past. You knew we all thought you were just—" She stopped, seeming to realize she was about to say something she couldn't take back. "Just what?" Nora asked, and her voice was still quiet, but there was steel underneath now, barely concealed. "Just an assistant? Just the help? Just someone who didn't deserve to be here?" "That's not what I meant," Camilla said quickly. "Isn't it?" Nora's eyes moved from Camilla to Javier and back again. "You invited me to this event knowing I probably couldn't afford an appropriate dress, knowing I didn't know anyone here, knowing I'd feel out of place and uncomfortable. That was the point, wasn't it? To make me feel small?" "Nora," Javier started, but she held up one hand, not rudely, just firmly. "It's fine," she said. "I understand how these things work. I've been on both sides of them. But here's what you didn't count on. I don't need your permission to belong in rooms like this. I've earned my place in rooms much more important than this one. And when I decided to step away from that world, it was my choice. Not a failure. Not a fall from grace. My choice." Camilla opened her mouth, but before she could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me, are you Nora Vale?" They turned to find a woman in her 40s, dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She held a small leather notebook and had the slightly rumpled look of someone who'd come to this event for work rather than pleasure. "I am," Nora said cautiously. "Jennifer Reeves, the Ledger International," the woman said, extending her hand. "I was across the room when Etienne Marceau recognized you, and I have to admit I was intrigued. I've been covering international development work for 15 years, and your name came up several times in my research, the literacy program in Eastern Europe, the sustainable funding model, the policy recommendations that influenced World Bank protocols." Nora shook her hand, and Javier could see wariness settling over her like a cloak. "That was years ago," she said carefully. "Important work doesn't stop being important just because time passes," Jennifer said. "I'm doing a piece on where the architects of successful development programs end up, tracking careers, looking at how expertise flows between sectors. Would you be willing to answer a few questions? Just briefly, I promise not to monopolize your evening." Javier saw Nora's hesitation, saw her glance around the ballroom as if looking for an escape route. This wasn't what she'd come here for. Whatever her reasons for accepting the invitation, becoming the center of attention clearly wasn't part of the plan. "Actually," Camilla said suddenly, her voice bright with false friendliness, "I'm not sure this is the appropriate venue for an interview. This is a private event, after all." Jennifer Reeves turned to look at Camilla with the expression journalists reserved for people who tried to manage information they had no right to control. "I'm a guest," she said flatly. "The Ledger purchased a table, and I'm asking Ms. Vale a question, not you." The put-down was so casual, so complete, that several people nearby struggled to hide smiles. Camilla's face flushed dark red, and Javier felt a sudden urge to intervene, to smooth things over, to restore some kind of social equilibrium. But before he could speak, Nora made her decision. "All right," she said to Jennifer. "A few questions. But can we step out to the terrace? It's quieter there." "Perfect," Jennifer agreed. As they moved toward the French doors leading to the outdoor space, Javier found himself following, drawn by the same impulse that had made him watch Nora all evening, the need to understand who she really was, to reconcile the quiet assistant with the woman Etienne Marceau had embraced like a lost prodigy. Camilla hissed something under her breath, but he barely heard it. His attention was focused entirely on Nora's back, on the way she moved through the crowd with unconscious grace, on the question that kept circling through his mind like a persistent ghost. Who the hell was Nora Vale? The terrace overlooked Fifth Avenue, the city spreading out below them in rivers of light and shadow. The air was cool enough to make Nora wrap her arms around herself, and Javier noticed that she'd come outside without a wrap or jacket. The dress that had looked so perfect inside suddenly seemed inadequate against the October evening. Jennifer Reeves pulled out her phone, opened a recording app, and looked at Nora with the focused attention of someone who knew how to ask questions that mattered. So, Nora Vale, 5 years ago, you were coordinating a 6-country literacy initiative that won international acclaim. Today, you're working as an administrative assistant at a Manhattan law firm. What happened? It was a blunt question, almost rude in its directness, but Javier saw something in Nora's expression shift, a kind of appreciation for the honesty, for not dancing around the obvious. Life happened, Nora said simply. I was engaged. My fiancé worked in international development too, and we were building this beautiful life together. Planning a wedding, planning our careers, planning everything. She paused, looking out at the city lights. Javier found himself holding his breath, waiting. He died, Nora continued, her voice quieter now, but steady. Sudden illness. One of those nightmare scenarios where someone is healthy and vital and then just gone, 3 weeks from first symptoms to funeral. I'm so sorry, Jennifer said, and her professional demeanor cracked just slightly, revealing genuine empathy underneath. Thank you, Nora said. It was 2 years ago. And afterward, I couldn't do the work anymore. Every project reminded me of him. Every conference, every meeting. We'd built so much together, so I stepped away. Came to New York because I'd never lived here, and it seemed far enough from everything that hurt. And you took a job as an assistant, Jennifer prompted gently. I took a job where no one knew me, Nora corrected, where I could show up, do good work, and go home without anyone asking me about my feelings or my plans or my future. It was exactly what I needed at the time. But Javier felt something twist in his chest. Guilt, shame, recognition of his own blindness. She'd been grieving. She'd been rebuilding herself from scratch. And he'd treated her like a convenient piece of office equipment, someone whose only value was in her ability to anticipate his needs and stay out of his way. Do you regret leaving that world? Jennifer asked. Nora considered the question for a long moment. I regret the circumstances that made it necessary, she said finally. But I don't regret the choice. Sometimes we need to become small again before we can figure out how to be big in a different way. And are you ready to be big again? A smile ghosted across Nora's face. I'm working on it, she said. Having coffee with Etienne Marceau this week feels like a step in that direction. Jennifer made a few notes, asked a few more questions about the literacy program's methodology and funding structure. Then she thanked Nora, promised to send her the piece before it ran, and headed back inside, leaving Javier and Nora alone on the terrace. The silence stretched between them, loaded with everything that hadn't been said in 14 months of working together. Javier knew he should say something, knew this was the moment to acknowledge his blindness, his casual cruelty, the invitation that had been meant to humiliate rather than honor. But Camilla appeared in the doorway before he could find the words. There you are, she said, her voice tight with barely suppressed anger. People are looking for you, Javier. Richard wants to introduce you to the Nakamura team's advance representatives. They're inside right now. Javier felt the pull of obligation, of networking opportunity, of everything his professional life had trained him to prioritize. I'll be right there, he said. But Camilla didn't move. She stood in the doorway, her eyes fixed on Nora with something close to hatred. That was quite a performance, she said coldly. The mysterious tragic backstory, the famous investor who just happens to show up, the journalist interview. Very calculated. Camilla, Javier said sharply. But Nora just looked at her with that same patient expression, like she was watching a child throw a tantrum and waiting for them to tire themselves out. You invited me here, she said quietly. I'm just existing. If that's threatening to you, that says more about your insecurities than my intentions. Camilla took a step forward, her hands clenched into fists. You think you're so special, she hissed. You think one fancy dress and one famous friend makes you belong here. But you're still just an assistant. You're still just someone who fetches coffee and files papers. That's all you'll ever be to anyone here. And there it was. The cruelty that had been lurking beneath Camilla's polished surface all along, finally dragged into the light, where everyone could see it clearly. Javier watched Nora's expression, waiting for anger, for hurt, for some sign that Camilla's words had landed. But what he saw instead was something closer to pity. "You're right," Nora said softly. "In your world, that's probably all I'll ever be. But here's the thing, Camilla. Your world is very, very small, and I've already lived in bigger ones." She moved past them both, back into the ballroom, leaving Javier and Camilla alone on the terrace with the city lights and the cold air and the growing realization that something fundamental had shifted in ways neither of them could control. "She needs to be put in her place," Camilla said, her voice shaking with rage. "This whole situation is completely inappropriate. You need to do something about her." Javier looked at his girlfriend, at the beautiful, furious woman who'd seemed so perfect when they'd started dating, who'd fit so seamlessly into his life because she'd never challenged him, never questioned him, never forced him to look at himself too closely. And he realized, with uncomfortable clarity, that he didn't like what he was seeing. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly. "Fire her for being more impressive than we assumed she was?" "I want you to remind her of her place," Camilla snapped. "She works for you. She doesn't get to come to events like this and make us all look like idiots." "She didn't make us look like idiots," Javier said, the words coming out slowly as understanding crystallized. "We did that ourselves, by treating her like she was less than human, by inviting her here as some kind of cruel joke, by being so goddamn blind that we couldn't see what was right in front of us." Camilla stared at him like he'd started speaking a foreign language. "Are you actually defending her after she humiliated us in front of everyone?" "She didn't humiliate us," Javier said, and he was starting to feel something new, anger, but not at Nora. "We humiliated ourselves, and you know what the worst part is? She tried to save us from it. She said she'd consider the invitation. She gave us an out, and we were too arrogant to take it." He walked back inside, leaving Camilla on the terrace, and immediately found himself swallowed by the event's continuation. Partners wanted introductions. Clients needed attention. The Nakamura representatives were indeed waiting, polite and precise in dark suits, and Javier spent the next hour performing the role he'd been trained for, charming, intelligent, focused. But part of his attention kept drifting across the ballroom to where Nora stood talking with a group that now included 2 senior partners, 3 managing directors from other firms, and someone who looked suspiciously like a deputy mayor. She was holding court without appearing to try, answering questions, sharing insights, making people laugh with subtle humor that Javier had never heard from her in 14 months of daily interaction. And he realized with devastating clarity that he'd never actually asked her to be herself. He'd asked her to be small, to be quiet, to be convenient. She'd obliged. Until tonight, when she'd decided to stop. The gala wound down around 11, guests filtering out into the October night with the satisfied exhaustion that came from successful networking. Javier stood near the coat check watching people leave, offering handshakes and promises to follow up on Monday. The Nakamura representatives had been impressed, the senior partners were pleased, and by every professional measure, the evening had been a triumph for Hartwell and Stone. But Javier couldn't shake the feeling that he'd lost something important without even realizing it had been at stake. Camilla had left an hour earlier, claiming a headache, but really just unable to stand being in the same room with Nora any longer. She'd kissed Javier's cheek with cold lips and whispered, "We need to talk about this tomorrow," in a tone that promised consequences. Now he watched as Nora collected her wrap from the coat check attendant, thanking the young man with the same courtesy she showed everyone, regardless of their position or status. Margaret Chen stood beside her, still deep in conversation about something that made them both lean in close, speaking in low, intense tones. "She's something, isn't she?" Richard Hartwell appeared at Javier's elbow, scotch still in hand, his expression thoughtful. "All this time, and we had no idea what we were sitting on." "No idea," Javier echoed, because what else could he say? "Margaret tells me Nora's work on educational infrastructure influenced policy in 12 countries, Richard continued. 12. And we had her scheduling your client meetings and ordering lunch. He shook his head slowly. "We're going to need to fix this. Can't afford to lose talent like that, especially not when the whole room just watched us fail to recognize it." "You want to promote her," Javier said flatly. "I want to utilize her properly," Richard corrected. "There's a difference. Monday morning, I'm having HR pull her file, review her actual qualifications, and figure out where she belongs. Probably a consulting role, maybe strategic advisory, something that actually makes sense for someone with her background. It was the right move, the smart move, the move that any competent managing partner would make after discovering they'd accidentally hired someone vastly overqualified for their position. But something about the casualness of it made Javier's jaw tighten. "Don't you think you should ask her what she wants?" he said quietly. Richard looked at him with surprise. "Of course we'll discuss it with her. I'm just saying we need to move quickly, before some other firm realizes what we've got and tries to poach her." Before Javier could respond, Nora and Margaret finished their conversation. They exchanged what looked like genuine affection, a brief hug, promises to connect during the week, and then Nora headed toward the exit. Javier found himself moving to intercept her, driven by an impulse he couldn't quite name. "Nora, wait." She paused, turning to face him with that same calm expression she'd worn all evening. Up close, he could see fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the slight slump in her shoulders that suggested the performance of the evening had taken more out of her than she'd let anyone see. "Yes?" she said, her voice professionally neutral. "I wanted to apologize," Javier said, and the words felt inadequate even as he spoke them. "For the invitation, for the way it was extended, for not knowing anything about your actual background or capabilities, for treating you like an assistant," Nora supplied gently. "That's what I am, Javier. That's the job I applied for, the job I accepted. You didn't do anything wrong by treating me like the role I chose. But if you'd known what?" Nora asked, and there was something sharp in her voice now, finally, after hours of perfect composure. "You would have treated me differently? Been nicer? Actually seen me as a human being with a history and complexity?" That's the problem, isn't it? People shouldn't have to prove they're impressive before they deserve basic dignity. The words hit like a physical blow, all the more devastating for being delivered in that same quiet, measured tone. Javier opened his mouth to defend himself, to explain, to somehow make this conversation end differently than it was clearly going to end. But Nora wasn't finished. "I knew what tonight was," she continued, her gray eyes steady on his face. "I knew why Camilla suggested inviting me, and I knew why you agreed. It was supposed to be humiliating. I was supposed to stay home or show up and feel small or make some kind of scene that you could all laugh about on Monday. And maybe 2 years ago, I would have let that happen. Maybe I would have just absorbed it, the way women are trained to absorb casual cruelty from people who have power over them. Nora, I never meant... But here's what you need to understand," she said, and her voice was still quiet, but there was steel underneath now. The kind of strength that came from surviving genuine loss and coming out the other side. "I've buried someone I loved. I've walked away from work that defined me because staying would have destroyed me. I've rebuilt myself from nothing in a city where I knew no one. So your girlfriend's petty mean girl games? Your casual dismissal of my humanity? That's just noise. It doesn't touch me where I actually live." She stepped closer, and Javier found himself unable to look away from those steady gray eyes. "I came tonight because I wanted to prove something to myself," Nora said. "Not to you, not to Camilla, not to anyone else in that ballroom. To myself. I wanted to know if I could still walk into rooms like that and remember who I used to be. Who I still am underneath the grief and the rebuilding and the careful smallness I've been practicing for 2 years." "And could you?" Javier asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "Yes," Nora said simply. "I could. And now I know. So thank you for the invitation, even if the motivation behind it was cruel. It gave me something I needed." She moved past him toward the exit, and Javier watched her go, feeling like he'd just failed a test he hadn't known he was taking. The weekend passed in a blur of uncomfortable silence and difficult conversations. Camilla came to his apartment Saturday afternoon, still furious about the gala, and they had the kind of fight that felt more like a negotiation between hostile powers than an actual emotional exchange. "She made fools of us," Camilla kept saying, pacing his living room in designer athleisure, her hair pulled back in a severe ponytail. Walking in there with her sad backstory and her famous friends, playing the victim while making us look like villains. "It was calculated, Javier. All of it." "Or," Javier said carefully, "she's just a person with a complicated history who accepted an invitation to an event. Maybe it's not that deep." "Not that deep?" Camilla's laugh was sharp and humorless. Half the firm is talking about how we didn't recognize her talents. Richard Hartwell spent 20 minutes at the coat check telling anyone who'd listen about her international development work. Margaret Chen is probably already trying to recruit her for some special project. And Jennifer Reeves from the Ledger is writing a goddamn profile piece that will make us all look blind and stupid. Maybe we were blind, Javier said quietly. Camilla stopped pacing and stared at him. Are you seriously taking her side in this? I'm not taking sides. I'm just saying maybe we should examine why we're so angry at her for being more than we assumed she was. I'm angry because she's disrupting everything, Camilla snapped. She's your assistant, Javier. She's supposed to stay in her lane, do her job, and not make waves. That's how organizations work. That's how hierarchies work. You can't just have people randomly deciding to be different than what they were hired to be. She didn't decide anything, Javier countered, feeling his own frustration building. We made assumptions about her based on her job title and the fact that she didn't volunteer her entire life story. That's on us, not her. So what are you saying? That you want to promote her? Give her some special position because she impressed a few people at a party? I'm saying maybe we should treat her like a human being who deserves to be seen for who she actually is. Camilla's eyes narrowed. This isn't about her anymore, is it? This is about me. About us. You're angry about the invitation. I'm angry that we invited someone to an event specifically to humiliate them, Javier said bluntly. Yeah, Camilla, that bothers me. It bothers me a lot. Oh, please, Camilla said, her voice dripping with contempt. Don't act like you're suddenly developing a conscience. You went along with it. You thought it was funny. You handed her that invitation with a smile on your face. And she was right. That was the thing that made the anger curdle into shame. He had gone along with it. He had thought it was harmless, maybe even a kind gesture in its own twisted way. He'd been so completely blind to the cruelty underneath that he'd participated without hesitation. You're right, he said quietly. I did. And I was wrong. Camilla stared at him for a long moment, and he watched something shift in her expression, calculation replacing anger, strategy replacing emotion. Fine, she said finally. You want to apologize to her? Go ahead. Make yourself feel better about being a good person. But don't expect me to participate in this redemption theater. I know what she is. What is she, Camilla? Dangerous, Camilla said softly. She's dangerous because she makes people question things that shouldn't be questioned, like whether the people at the top deserve to be there, whether the people at the bottom might actually belong somewhere higher. That kind of thinking destroys organizations, Javier. It creates chaos. She left shortly after, and Javier spent the rest of the weekend alone in his apartment, staring at his laptop without actually working, trying to figure out when he'd become the kind of person who saw human dignity as a threat to organizational stability. Monday morning arrived with the gray inevitability of all Mondays in Manhattan. Javier got to the office early, before 7, hoping to get some work done before the inevitable post-gala analysis began. But when he stepped off the elevator on the 63rd floor, he found the place already buzzing with energy. Rosa Martinez caught him at the coffee station. You hear about Nora? She asked, her voice low and urgent. Javier's stomach dropped. What about her? Richard called her into his office first thing, like 6:30. They've been in there for over an hour. Do you know what it's about? Rosa shrugged, but her expression was worried. Could be anything. But you know how it works here. When partners start having early morning closed-door meetings with administrative staff, it's usually not good news. Javier made it to his office without running, but it was close. He dropped his briefcase and immediately pulled up his email, scanning for anything from Richard or HR or anyone that might explain what was happening. There was nothing. He was debating whether to just walk down to Richard's office and interrupt when his phone buzzed. A text from Camilla. Heard Richard's meeting with your assistant. Good. Maybe he's finally handling the situation. Javier deleted the message without responding. Then he stood, straightened his tie, and headed toward the corner office where Richard Hartwell made decisions that shaped careers and destroyed them with equal ease. The door was closed, but through the glass panel he could see Nora sitting across from Richard, her posture straight, her expression calm. Richard was talking, gesturing occasionally, and Nora was listening with that same focused attention she brought to everything. Javier raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. This wasn't his conversation to interrupt. Whatever was happening in that office, it was between Nora and the managing partner, and he had no right to insert himself into it, but he stood there anyway, watching through the glass, feeling helpless and angry and ashamed in equal measure. The meeting broke up 20 minutes later. Richard opened his door, and Javier heard him saying, "Think about it over the next few days. We don't need an answer immediately, but I'd like to move forward by the end of the week." Nora emerged, and her face was unreadable. She saw Javier standing there, and something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, maybe, or resignation. "Walk with me," Javier said, before he could think better of it. Nora glanced at her watch, then nodded. "I have 10 minutes before the morning briefs need to go out." They walked to the small conference room at the end of the hall, empty at this hour, with windows that looked out over the East River. Javier closed the door and turned to find Nora already standing by the window, her arms wrapped around herself in a gesture that looked like self-protection. "What did Richard want?" Javier asked. "To offer me a position," Nora said quietly. "Senior consultant in the firm's new strategic advisory division. They're building it out specifically to handle nonprofit sector clients, international development work, that kind of thing. He wants me to help design the practice and then lead it." It was exactly what Richard had predicted, exactly the kind of smart business move that capitalized on unexpected assets. And it was objectively a good offer, probably a significant salary increase, certainly more responsibility, the chance to do work that actually mattered. "That's great," Javier said, and heard how hollow the words sounded. "Is it?" Nora turned to look at him, and her expression was complicated, part frustration, part sadness, part something that might have been disappointment. 3 days ago, I was invisible. I was the woman who fetched your coffee. And now, because some people at a party realized I used to be impressive, suddenly I'm valuable? Suddenly I deserve a real position. "You always deserved it," Javier said. "But nobody noticed until it became embarrassing not to," Nora countered. "That's the part that bothers me, Javier. Not that they're offering me something better, that they only thought to look because keeping me as an assistant started making them look bad." "So you're going to turn it down?" Nora was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the river, at the boats moving slowly through gray water under a gray sky. "I don't know," she said finally. "Part of me wants to. Part of me wants to quit entirely, walk away from this place and everyone in it, go back to doing work that actually matters instead of helping rich people get richer. But I need the job," Nora said simply. "I need the stability. I need the health insurance. I need the regular paycheck that lets me pay rent and student loans and all the boring practical things that don't care about my principles or my pride." She laughed, a small, sad sound. "That's the trap, isn't it? They can treat you however they want because leaving costs too much." Javier felt the truth of that settle over him like a weight. He'd never had to worry about health insurance or rent, or whether leaving a job would destroy his financial stability. His family had money, connections, safety nets that meant he could take risks because failure wouldn't actually hurt him. Nora had none of that. And neither did most of the people who worked in the administrative pool, the paralegals, the junior associates scrambling to make partner before their loans crushed them. "For what it's worth," Javier said quietly, "I think you should take the position. Not because it's what the firm deserves, but because it's work you're good at, work that matters. And you could probably help a lot of people if you were in a position to actually influence how the firm approaches that sector." "You think I should stay?" Nora said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I think you should do whatever makes you feel whole again," Javier said. "But if you're asking my opinion as someone who's watched you work for 14 months and only just now actually saw you, yeah, I think you should stay. I think you should take the position and build something real and make them all remember that they almost missed you entirely." Nora turned to face him fully, and her expression was softer now, some of the hardness melting away. "Why do you care?" she asked. "Honest question. You've got your own career to worry about, your own trajectory. Why does it matter to you what I do?" Javier opened his mouth, then closed it, trying to find words for something he barely understood himself. "Because I was part of the problem," he said finally. "Because I treated you like you didn't matter, and that was wrong. And I can't undo it. But maybe if you stay and succeed, that's some kind of proof that we can do better, that I can do better." "That's a lot of weight to put on one personnel decision," Nora said, but there was something almost gentle in her voice. "I know, Javier admitted. And it's selfish. I'm making your career about my redemption, which is probably just another way of not actually seeing you. I'm sorry, I'm not very good at this. At what? At being a decent human being, apparently, Javier said. And despite everything, Nora laughed. You're not as bad as you think you are, she said. Just thoughtless. Privileged in ways you don't examine. But not cruel, I don't think. Not at your core. That's probably more generous than I deserve, Javier said. Probably, Nora agreed. But I'm working on being less angry at the world. Anger takes energy, and I've got limited reserves these days. Her watch beeped softly, and she glanced down. I need to get those briefs out, she said, before someone decides I'm already too important to do actual work. She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. Javier, thank you for asking what I wanted. Instead of just telling me what you thought I should do, that means something. Then she was gone, and Javier was left alone in the conference room with the gray river and the complicated feeling that he'd just had one of the most important conversations of his career, and he wasn't sure if he'd passed or failed. The week that followed was strange in ways Javier hadn't anticipated. The office hummed with gossip about Nora's impending promotion, about the Gala revelation, about Etienne Marceau's obvious respect, and Jennifer Reeves's forthcoming article. People who'd walked past Nora's desk for 14 months, without acknowledging her, suddenly remembered they'd always thought she was talented, always suspected she was destined for bigger things. It was revisionist history on a grand scale, and it made Javier's skin crawl. Camila, meanwhile, had gone cold. She still came to firm events, still smiled at the right people and said the right things, but with Javier she was distant, calculating. They had dinner twice that week, and both times felt like negotiations between rival firms rather than dates between people who were supposed to care about each other. You're being ridiculous about this whole situation, she said Wednesday night over sushi neither of them was really eating. It's a personnel issue. It has nothing to do with us. It has everything to do with us, Javier countered. The way we treated her, the assumptions we made, those came from somewhere, Camila, from attitudes and beliefs that maybe we should examine. You want me to apologize for having standards? Camila's voice was sharp. For believing that organizational hierarchies exist for a reason? For thinking that people should stay in their designated roles instead of causing chaos? I want you to see people as human beings instead of game pieces, Javier said quietly. Camila set down her chopsticks with deliberate precision. I think we need some space, she said. You're clearly working through something, and I don't need to be collateral damage while you have your little crisis of conscience. She left him with the check and the uncomfortable realization that he wasn't particularly sad to see her go. Thursday afternoon, Javier had a meeting scheduled with the Nakamura advance team, preliminary discussions about the structure of the deal, cultural considerations, timeline expectations. It was the kind of meeting that could make or break the entire negotiation, and he'd been preparing for it all week, but 20 minutes before it was scheduled to start, Richard Hartwell appeared in his doorway, looking grim. We have a problem, Richard said without preamble. The Nakamura team requested that Nora Vale attend the meeting. Javier blinked. Why would they request that? Apparently one of their delegation met her at the gala, was impressed by her international development background. They're interested in discussing potential corporate social responsibility initiatives as part of the deal, and they specifically asked if she could provide insight. It should have been good news. The clients wanted additional services, wanted to expand the scope of the engagement, wanted Hartwell and Stone to provide value beyond just the basic legal work. But Richard looked troubled, and Javier immediately understood why. Camila's going to be in that meeting, Javier said slowly. Camila's leading the regulatory compliance portion, Richard confirmed. And given her reaction to Nora at the gala, I'm concerned about potential tension. Can we uninvite Camila? Can we uninvite the daughter of one of our biggest referral sources? Richard's tone made it clear what he thought of that idea. No, we're going to have to manage this carefully. You'll moderate. Keep things professional. If Camila starts anything, shut it down immediately. And if Nora starts something, Richard gave him a look. Nora's not the one I'm worried about. The meeting convened in the large conference room with the best view, the one they used for impressing important clients. The Nakamura team arrived exactly on time, 3 representatives led by Kenji Nakamura himself, a man in his 50s with sharp eyes and the kind of quietness that suggested he missed nothing. Camilla was already there, looking flawless in a charcoal suit, her hair pulled back severely, her expression professionally neutral. But Javier could see the tension in her shoulders, the tightness around her mouth. Nora arrived last, and Javier watched the subtle shift in the room's energy. She wore a simple navy dress, probably the same one she'd worn to the office 100 times. But she carried herself differently now, like she'd remembered something she'd forgotten, and that remembering had changed her relationship to space and power and presence. "Miss Vale," Kenji Nakamura said, standing to greet her with a slight bow. "Thank you for joining us. My colleague Hiroshi spoke very highly of your work after meeting you Saturday evening." "Mr. Nakamura," Nora replied, returning the bow with exactly the right depth and duration. "I'm honored. Please, let's sit." The meeting began with standard agenda items: deal structure, timeline, regulatory requirements. Camilla presented her compliance analysis with crisp efficiency, and Javier had to admit she was good at her job. Whatever personal feelings she had, she kept them locked away when it mattered professionally. Then Kenji Nakamura turned to Nora. "We've been considering how to structure our corporate social responsibility initiatives in the American market," he said. "In Japan, there are clear cultural expectations about corporate citizenship. Here, the landscape is more complex. Hiroshi mentioned you have experience designing sustainable programs in emerging markets. We wondered if similar principles might apply." Nora was quiet for a moment, and Javier could see her thinking, organizing her thoughts with the same careful precision she brought to everything. "The principles are often universal," she said finally. "But the implementation has to be culturally specific. What kind of initiatives were you considering?" For the next 40 minutes, Javier watched Nora transform from an administrative assistant into the international development expert she'd actually been all along. She asked probing questions about the Nakamura Corporation's values, their long-term strategic goals, their existing philanthropic footprint in Japan. She suggested frameworks for thinking about corporate social responsibility, not as charity, but as sustainable investment in community infrastructure. She was brilliant. Not flashy, not performative, just genuinely, impressively brilliant in a way that made everyone in the room lean forward and pay attention. And Camilla was dying inside. Javier could see it in the way her jaw tightened, the way her fingers gripped her pen, the way her eyes kept darting between Nora and the Nakamura team as if she couldn't quite believe what was happening. When Nora finished outlining a potential program structure, Kenji Nakamura nodded thoughtfully. "This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need," he said. "Ms. Vale, would you be willing to serve as lead consultant on the CSR component of this engagement?" Before Nora could answer, Camilla spoke. "With respect, Mr. Nakamura, Ms. Vale's current role is administrative. We have entire practice groups dedicated to corporate social responsibility. Wouldn't it make more sense to involve lawyers who specialize in this area?" The room went very quiet. Kenji Nakamura looked at Camilla with the kind of polite confusion that suggested he genuinely didn't understand the objection. "We're not looking for traditional legal advice on this component," he said carefully. "We're looking for strategic program design. Ms. Vale has demonstrated expertise in exactly that area. I just think we should be thoughtful about how we deploy our resources," Camilla continued, and her voice had taken on an edge that made Javier's stomach clench. "Miss Vale is very capable, I'm sure, but she's not actually a lawyer. She doesn't have standing to provide legal counsel." "We're not asking for legal counsel," Kenji said, and now there was a note of steel in his quiet voice. "We're asking for program development expertise, which Miss Vale appears to have in abundance." Nora had gone very still, her expression carefully blank, but Javier could see the way her hands had folded in her lap, the way she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. "Camilla," Javier said quietly, "perhaps we could discuss resource allocation after—" "I'm just being realistic," Camilla interrupted, looking directly at Nora now, with barely concealed contempt. "We all saw the performance at the Gala, the tragic backstory, the impressive credentials. But this is a business, not a charity. We have actual professionals who do this work. We don't need to hand major client initiatives to an assistant just because she managed to impress some people at a party." The silence that followed was devastating. Kenji Nakamura set down his pen with deliberate precision. Ms. De La Vega, he said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority, in Japan, we have a concept called motainai. It means regret over waste, watching your firm waste, miss. Vali's talents for what I assume has been months, possibly years. That is motainai. It is wasteful, and it reflects poorly on your organization's ability to recognize and utilize excellence. He turned to Richard Hartwell, who'd gone pale. We came to this meeting excited about the possibility of working with Hartwell and Stone. We saw Ms. Vale's presence as evidence that your firm was forward-thinking, that you valued diverse expertise, that you understood modern corporate needs extend beyond traditional legal services. Kenji gathered his materials slowly, methodically. But what I see instead is internal politics, professional jealousy, and a willingness to dismiss expertise based on job titles rather than actual capabilities. This is not the kind of organization we wish to partner with. Mr. Nakamura, Richard said, standing quickly, panic evident in his voice. Please, let's not make hasty decisions. Ms. De La Vega spoke out of turn. We absolutely value— I'm sure you do, Kenji said politely, but we need to reconsider whether our values align with yours. We will be in touch. The Nakamura team left, their exit polite and professional and absolutely final in its implications. The moment the door closed behind them, Richard turned on Camilla with barely controlled fury. What the hell was that? I was protecting the firm's professional standards, Camilla said, but her voice was shaking now. We can't just hand client work to unqualified— Unqualified? Richard's voice cracked like a whip. You just cost us a $200 million deal because you couldn't handle your personal feelings about Nora's presence. That client specifically requested her participation, and you undermined her in front of them. Do you have any idea what you've done? Camilla's face had gone white. They can't walk away over something this small. They're just posturing. We can salvage— You're suspended, Richard said flatly. Effective immediately. 2 weeks, unpaid. Go home and think about whether you actually want a career in this profession, because right now I'm not sure you have the judgment for it. You can't be serious, Camilla whispered. Try me, Richard said. Then he turned to Nora, and his voice gentled. Miss Vale, I apologize for what just happened. It was unprofessional, inappropriate, and completely unacceptable. I hope you'll still consider the consulting position we discussed. Clearly, we need people like you more than I even realized. Nora stood slowly, and Javier could see she was trembling. I need some air, she said quietly. I'll give you my answer by Friday, as we agreed. She left, and Javier found himself following her again, leaving Richard and Camilla to whatever accounting came next. He caught up with her in the stairwell, that concrete emergency escape that no one ever used because elevators existed and stairs were for people who'd given up on efficiency. Nora was leaning against the wall, her eyes closed, her breathing deliberate and controlled like she was counting seconds between inhales. Are you okay? Javier asked, knowing it was a stupid question but unable to think of anything better. Nora opened her eyes and looked at him, and he saw something raw there that she'd been hiding behind all that careful composure. No, she said simply. I'm not okay. I just watched someone try to destroy my professional credibility in front of important clients because she couldn't handle her own insecurity. And the worst part is, I saw it coming. I knew exactly what she was going to do, and I walked into that room anyway. You couldn't have known she'd actually sabotage the deal, Javier said. Couldn't I? Nora's laugh was bitter. Women like Camilla don't suddenly become reasonable when they feel threatened. They double down. They attack. They make sure everyone remembers that hierarchies exist for a reason, and people who forget their place need to be reminded. She pushed off from the wall and started down the stairs, not toward any particular destination, just moving because standing still felt impossible. Javier followed, their footsteps echoing in the empty concrete shaft. She's been undermining me all week, Nora continued, her voice echoing slightly. Little things. Mentioning to people that my credentials are old, that I haven't worked in international development for years, that maybe I'm exaggerating what I actually accomplished, planting seeds of doubt so that when a moment like this came, people would be primed to question whether I really deserve to be in the room. How do you know all this? Javier asked. Rosa told me, Nora said, and Linda in HR, and 2 of the junior associates who felt bad about it. People talk, Javier, especially to the woman who used to be invisible. They forget I can hear them, or maybe they just don't care because I'm still just the assistant in their minds. They'd reached the landing between floors, a small space with a grimy window that looked out onto an air shaft. Not exactly inspiring, but it was private, and right now that seemed to matter more than aesthetics. For what it's worth, Javier said quietly, Richard's furious with her. I've never seen him that angry. She might actually lose her job over this. I don't want her to lose her job, Nora said, turning to face him. I don't want to be the reason anyone's career gets destroyed, even someone who tried to destroy mine. That's not who I am. Then who are you? Javier asked, and it was the question he'd been wanting to ask since Saturday night, since he'd watched her walk into that ballroom, and realized he didn't know the first real thing about the woman who'd been making his coffee for 14 months. Nora was quiet for a long moment, looking out the grimy window at the narrow slice of sky visible between buildings. I'm someone who used to believe work could change the world, she said finally. I built programs that taught adults to read, that gave people access to information and opportunity they'd never had before. I watched a 60-year-old grandmother in Slovakia read her first book and cry because she'd spent her whole life pretending she could read, ashamed to admit she couldn't. I helped create systems that meant her grandchildren would never have to pretend. Her voice had gone soft with memory, with loss. And I did it with someone I loved, someone who believed in the same things, who saw the same possibilities. We were going to get married in Prague, in this tiny church near the literacy center we'd built. We were going to spend our lives doing this work together. What was his name? Javier asked gently. Marcus, Nora said, and even saying the name seemed to cost her something. Marcus Chen, Margaret's younger brother. The revelation hit Javier like a physical blow. Margaret's brother, he repeated slowly. That's why she was so warm with you at the gala. That's why you two were talking like old friends. We were family, Nora said, or we were going to be. Margaret was going to be my sister-in-law. She'd already started planning the bachelorette party, already bought her dress for the wedding. And then Marcus got sick, and 3 weeks later he was gone, and all those plans just evaporated like they'd never existed. She wiped at her eyes angrily, frustrated by the tears that had started falling despite her obvious efforts to control them. I couldn't stay in that world after he died. Couldn't walk into those offices, couldn't attend those conferences, couldn't do that work without seeing him everywhere. So I came here. Found the most anonymous job I could, in a city where I knew almost no one, and I just tried to survive each day without falling apart completely. And you've been surviving as my assistant, Javier said, understanding dawning with painful clarity. Watching me treat you like you were disposable. Listening to Camilla's casual cruelty. Staying small and quiet because that's what you needed to feel safe. It was working, Nora said. Until you invited me to that gala and forced me to remember that I used to be someone who didn't hide. Someone who walked into rooms full of powerful people and demanded they listen because what I had to say mattered. I'm sorry, Javier said, and the words felt pathetically inadequate. For all of it. For not seeing you. For the invitation. For not protecting you in that meeting just now. For everything. You're not responsible for Camilla's behavior, Nora said. I'm responsible for my own, Javier countered. And my behavior has been almost as bad, just more passive. I let her talk about you the way she did. I laughed at jokes that weren't funny. I participated in a system that treated you as less than human. And I did it without even thinking about it because thinking would have been uncomfortable. Nora studied him for a long moment, her gray eyes red-rimmed but clear. What changed? She asked. Why do you care now? It was a fair question. Javier thought about the easy answer, that the gala had opened his eyes, that seeing her shine had made him realize what he'd missed. But that wasn't quite right, wasn't quite honest. I watched you walk into that ballroom, he said slowly, and I saw you refuse to be small. You could have stayed home. You could have shown up and been quiet and let the evening happen to you. But you chose to be yourself, completely and unapologetically, and it was the bravest thing I've ever seen. It didn't feel brave, Nora said. It felt necessary. That's what brave usually feels like, Javier said. Like you don't have a choice, because the alternative is losing yourself completely. They stood there in the stairwell, two people trying to figure out how to move forward from a moment that had broken something fundamental. Above them, Javier could hear the muffled sounds of the office continuing. Phones ringing, voices raised in discussion, the normal machinery of business grinding forward as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. They both knew it. "I need to make a decision about Richard's offer," Nora said finally. "And I need to make it based on what's right for me, not what's right for the firm, or what makes anyone else comfortable. Can you respect that?" "Absolutely," Javier said. "Whatever you decide, I'll support it." "Even if I decide to leave?" "Even then," Javier said, and meant it. "You don't owe this place anything, Nora, not after how we've treated you." Nora nodded slowly, then moved past him toward the door that led back to the office floor. "I'm going home for the day," she said. "I can't be here right now. Tell Richard I'll have an answer for him by Friday morning." "I will," Javier promised. She paused with her hand on the door handle. "Javier, thank you for following me, for listening, for seeing me, even if it took you a while to get there." Then she was gone, and Javier was left alone in the stairwell with the uncomfortable knowledge that he'd been complicit in something ugly, and apologies couldn't undo that. Only actions could, only change. He went back to the office to find chaos. Word of the Nakamura deal's collapse had spread through the firm with viral speed, and everyone had opinions about who was responsible and what should happen next. Most of those opinions centered on Camilla, who'd already been escorted from the building by security with her personal items in a box, a suspension that looked and felt a lot like the beginning of termination. Richard called an emergency partners meeting, and Javier sat through 90 minutes of damage control strategy. Could they salvage the Nakamura relationship? Should they reach out directly to apologize? What message did this send to other clients about the firm's internal culture? Margaret Chen, normally quiet in these meetings, spoke up with unusual force. "The message it sends," she said clearly, "is that we don't know how to recognize talent, that we hire brilliant people and then waste them in roles that insult their capabilities, that we allow personal politics to sabotage professional opportunities. And frankly, that message is accurate. We should be embarrassed." "The situation with Ms. Vale is complicated," one of the older partners began, but Margaret cut him off. "It's not complicated," she said. "It's simple. We hired someone extraordinary and treated her like she was ordinary. We created an environment where she felt she had to hide her abilities to survive. And when she finally showed us who she really was, instead of celebrating that or examining our own blindness, we let someone attack her publicly because of personal jealousy. That's not complicated. That's just shameful." The meeting ended without clear resolution, everyone uncomfortable with Margaret's assessment but unable to refute it. Javier left feeling hollowed out, exhausted by the weight of recognizing his own failures. That evening, he went home to his expensive apartment with its view of the park and its furniture that cost more than Nora probably made in 6 months. He poured himself a scotch he didn't really want and sat in the dark, thinking about privilege and blindness and all the ways he'd moved through the world without ever having to think about how his comfort was built on other people's invisibility. His phone buzzed. A text from Camilla. "We need to talk. This is ridiculous. Richard's overreacting. You know I was just trying to maintain professional standards." Javier stared at the message for a long time. Then he typed a response. "You tried to destroy someone's career because you felt threatened by her competence. That's not maintaining standards. That's cruelty. We're done, Camilla. Don't contact me again." He hit send before he could second-guess himself, then blocked her number. It felt both significant and inadequate, ending a relationship that had probably been dead since the gala, but taking until now to formally acknowledge it. The next morning, Javier arrived at the office to find an email from Kenji Nakamura waiting in his inbox. His heart sank, assuming it was formal notification that they were withdrawing from the deal entirely. But when he opened it, the message was unexpected. "Mr. Rivas, after consultation with my team, we would like to offer Miss Vale the opportunity to work with us directly on the CSR initiative, not through Hartwell and Stone, but as an independent consultant. We believe her expertise is valuable regardless of her institutional affiliation. If she accepts, and if she is willing to recommend legal counsel for the broader deal, we would consider resuming negotiations with your firm. But our continued engagement is contingent on her involvement and her endorsement of your organization's values. Please share this with Ms. Vale at your earliest convenience. Regards, Kenji Nakamura." Javier read the email 3 times, understanding dawning slowly. The Nakamura team wasn't walking away from Nora. They were walking away from Hartwell and Stone unless Nora vouched for them. They'd essentially given her veto power over a $200 million deal. It was unprecedented. It was brilliant. And it meant Nora held more power in this situation than anyone else, including the managing partner. He forwarded the email to Richard with a simple message. You should see this before we discuss Nora's employment status any further. Richard's response came within minutes. My office. Now. The conversation that followed was tense and complicated. Richard wanted to offer Nora whatever it took to secure her endorsement, partnership track, equity stake, carte blanche to build her own practice. But Javier found himself pushing back, arguing that they needed to give her space to make her own decision without pressure. She's been manipulated and used enough, Javier said firmly. We don't get to do it again, even with good intentions. We present the Nakamura offer, we reiterate our previous consulting offer, and then we let her decide. No pressure, no strings, no expectations. Richard looked at him with something approaching respect. When did you develop a conscience? He asked, not unkindly. Recently, Javier admitted, still figuring out how to use it. Thursday passed in a strange limbo. Nora didn't come to the office, and Javier spent the day handling her usual administrative tasks himself, scheduling meetings, organizing files, preparing documents, and discovering just how much invisible labor she'd been doing to make his professional life function smoothly. It was humbling in ways he hadn't anticipated. That evening, Margaret Chen called him. I'm having dinner with Nora tonight, she said without preamble. She asked me to help her think through her options. I wanted you to know that I'm going to encourage her to walk away from Hartwell and Stone entirely. Even with the Nakamura opportunity? Javier asked. Especially with that, Margaret said. She could take their offer, build her own consulting practice, work with clients who actually value her without having to navigate our toxic internal politics. Why would she stay here? Because it's stable, Javier said. Because starting over is scary. Because sometimes the devil you know feels safer than the unknown. She already started over once, Margaret countered. After Marcus died, after she lost everything that mattered to her. She survived that. She can survive this. I know, Javier said quietly. I'm just saying I'll understand if she chooses stability over potential. That doesn't make her weak. It makes her human. Margaret was quiet for a moment. You care about her, she said, and it wasn't quite a question. I care about doing right by her, Javier said carefully. After doing wrong for so long. That's not the same thing as caring about her as a person, Margaret observed. I'm working on it, Javier admitted. Friday morning arrived with rain, the kind of steady autumn precipitation that turned Manhattan gray and reflective. Javier got to the office early, made his own coffee for the first time in months, and tried not to watch the elevator every time the doors opened. Nora arrived at 9, professional and composed in a dark gray suit he'd seen her wear dozens of times. She went straight to Richard's office, and Javier watched through the glass as they talked for nearly an hour. When she emerged, Richard looked relieved and exhausted in equal measure. Nora's expression was harder to read, calm, but with something underneath that might have been sadness or might have been peace. She walked to her desk, gathered a few personal items, and then came to Javier's office. She knocked on the doorframe, and he looked up from the email he'd been pretending to read. Can I come in? She asked. Of course, Javier said, standing automatically. Nora closed the door and sat down across from his desk, her posture straight, her hands folded in her lap. I wanted to tell you myself before it becomes general knowledge, she said. I'm leaving Hartwell and Stone. I'm taking the Nakamura consulting offer and building my own practice. I recommended that they resume negotiations with the firm, but I'll be working with them independently. Javier felt something settle in his chest. Disappointment, yes, but also something that felt like rightness. Like this was how it was supposed to end. How it needed to end. That's the right choice, he said. For you, I mean, professionally and personally. You deserve to work somewhere that sees your value from the start. Richard made me a very generous counteroffer, Nora said. Partnership track, my own practice group, significant resources. It was tempting, but I'd always be the woman who had to prove she belonged, Nora said quietly. I'd always be fighting against people's initial impressions, their memories of me as just the assistant. And I'm tired of fighting that battle. I want to work with people who respect me from the beginning. That makes sense, Javier said. Nora looked at him for a long moment, her gray eyes thoughtful. Can I ask you something? And will you answer honestly? I'll try, Javier said. What did you think of me? Nora asked. Before the gala, when I was just your assistant. What did you actually think about me as a person? Javier took a breath, knowing this was important. Knowing dishonesty here would poison whatever fragile understanding they'd built over the past week. I didn't, he said simply. I didn't think about you as a person. You were a function, a role, someone who made my life easier without me having to acknowledge the work involved. I'm not proud of that, but it's the truth. Nora nodded slowly, like he'd confirmed something she'd already known. Thank you for being honest, she said. What did you think of me? Javier asked, turning the question around. I thought you were everything Marcus wasn't, Nora said. Privileged where he'd had to work for everything, thoughtless where he was constantly aware of how his actions affected others, comfortable where he was always questioning whether he deserved his success. She paused. But I also thought you had the capacity to be better. That you were thoughtless, not from malice, but from never being challenged to think differently. Was I right? Javier asked. Am I getting better? You're trying, Nora said. That's something. Whether it lasts once I'm gone and you're not being forced to confront your own behavior anymore, that remains to be seen. It was a fair assessment, maybe even generous. Javier felt the weight of it, the responsibility it implied. I want to be better, he said. Not just for you or because of you, but because I looked at myself this week and I didn't like what I saw. Then work on it, Nora said. Examine your assumptions. Question your comfort. Treat people like they have interior lives that matter, regardless of their job titles or their usefulness to you. She stood, preparing to leave. That's the best advice I can give you. Will you stay in touch? Javier asked, surprising himself with how much he wanted the answer to be yes. Maybe, Nora said. Once enough time has passed that we can talk without all this history weighing on every word. I'd like that, actually. I think you could be a good friend, Javier, if you keep working on being a better human. I'll take that as a challenge, Javier said. Nora smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. Good, she said. Then she extended her hand, formal and professional. Thank you for the opportunity to work here. And thank you for finally seeing me, even if it took a while. Javier shook her hand, feeling the finality of the gesture. Thank you for not giving up on being yourself, he said. Even when we gave you every reason to. She left his office, and Javier watched through the glass as she made her rounds, saying goodbye to Rosa and the other administrative staff, sharing a longer conversation with Margaret that ended in a tight embrace, accepting well wishes from junior associates who'd only just realized who she'd been all along. And then she was gone, walking out of Hartwell and Stone for the last time, carrying a small box of personal items and the weight of a future she was choosing for herself. The office felt different without her in it. Not immediately. The work continued, phones rang, meetings happened. But slowly, over the days that followed, Javier began to notice the gaps. The coffee that wasn't quite right. The files that weren't organized the way he needed them. The 100 small things Nora had done that he'd never acknowledged or appreciated until they stopped happening. The firm hired a new assistant, a capable young man named Derek, who was efficient and professional and nothing like Nora. Javier tried to treat him better, to see him as a person, to ask about his life and his goals and his reasons for being there. It was harder than he'd expected. Old habits ran deep. But he kept trying, kept catching himself when he started to slip into thoughtless patterns, kept remembering the way Nora had looked at him in that stairwell when she'd asked what had changed. He wanted to have a good answer the next time someone asked him that question. He wanted to be someone worth the effort she'd expended in believing he could be better. 3 weeks after Nora left, Jennifer Reeves's article published in the Ledger International. It was titled The Hidden Architect: How Extraordinary Talent Survives in Ordinary Spaces. And it told Nora's story with compassion and precision. It talked about her work in Eastern Europe, her engagement to Marcus Chen, her quiet disappearance from the international development world after his death. It described her time at Hartwell and Stone with careful diplomacy, noting the disconnect between her capabilities and her position without naming names or assigning explicit blame. But the implications were clear, and the article ended with Nora's new consulting practice, her work with the Nakamura Corporation, and her plans to build something meaningful from the pieces of her shattered earlier life. It was beautiful. It was honest. And it made Javier's chest ache with something he couldn't quite name, pride maybe, or regret, or recognition of everything that could have been different if he'd just bothered to look. The article went viral in legal circles, was shared widely on LinkedIn, and sparked conversations about how law firms utilize support staff and whether organizational hierarchies prevented recognition of extraordinary talent. Several partners mentioned it in meetings, usually with uncomfortable expressions that suggested they knew exactly how close they'd come to being named explicitly as the problem. Camilla was quietly terminated 2 days after the article published. No public announcement, just a careful separation agreement and a departure so quick most people didn't notice until her office was already being cleared out. Javier heard about it from Rosa, who'd heard about it from someone in HR. He felt nothing about Camilla's firing, no satisfaction, no sympathy, just a vague sense that consequences had arrived as they always eventually did. What he did feel was something different, something new, a determination to remember the lessons Nora had taught him, intentionally and otherwise. That people were complex and complete regardless of their position or their visibility. That dignity wasn't something you earned through impressive credentials, but something you deserved simply by being human. That kindness wasn't weakness, and seeing people clearly wasn't optional. He started having lunch with junior associates and administrative staff, asking about their lives and goals. He pushed back in meetings when partners made casual, dismissive comments about support staff. He recommended Derek for a legal training program because the young man had mentioned wanting to go to law school someday. They were small actions, insufficient to undo years of thoughtless behavior. But they were something. They were trying. And sometimes Javier was learning, trying was where change began. Late one Friday afternoon, about a month after Nora left, his phone rang with an unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Javier Rivas," he said. "Hi, Javier. It's Nora." Her voice was warm, easier than it had been during their last conversation. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Nothing that can't wait," Javier said, feeling something lift in his chest. "How are you? How's the new practice?" "Terrifying and wonderful in equal measure," Nora said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "I'm working with the Nakamura team on a literacy initiative for their American facilities. It's like coming home to work I'd forgotten I loved. And I met with Etienne Marceau yesterday about a potential partnership on a multi-country education project. It's early days, but it feels right." "That's amazing," Javier said, genuinely happy for her. "You deserve all of it." "I called because I wanted to thank you," Nora said, "for the email you sent to the partners after I left. Rosa forwarded it to me." Javier felt heat rise in his face. He'd written that email late one night, whiskey in hand, trying to articulate what he'd learned from watching Nora navigate an environment that had been hostile without ever being overtly cruel. He'd talked about invisible labor and unconscious bias, and the ways privilege blinded people to the humanity of others. He'd been honest about his own failures in ways that made him uncomfortable, and he'd sent it before he could second-guess himself. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said. "It was internal, for the partners to consider as they think about firm culture." "I know," Nora said, "but I'm glad I did. It mattered to me that you understood, that you were willing to examine your own behavior publicly. That takes courage." "It takes embarrassment," Javier corrected. "Courage would have been seeing it earlier." "Maybe," Nora allowed, "but growth doesn't happen on anyone's preferred timeline. It happens when it happens. The important thing is that it does happen."
You should be...
They talked for another 20 minutes about everything and nothing: her new apartment in Brooklyn, his efforts to reform how the firm treated junior staff, whether they'd both watched the same documentary about literacy rates in developing nations. It was easy, comfortable, the kind of conversation that suggested maybe, someday, they could actually be friends. "I should let you go," Nora said finally. "But Javier, keep trying, keep being better. The world needs more people willing to admit they were wrong and actually change because of it." "I will," Javier promised. "And Nora, thank you for not giving up on the idea that people can change, even when we give you plenty of reasons to." After they hung up, Javier sat in his office as evening light slanted through the windows, turning Manhattan golden and forgiving. He thought about the woman who'd made his coffee for 14 months, who'd been invisible until she chose to be seen, who'd taught him more about decency and dignity than any ethics class or professional development seminar ever had. And he thought about the man he wanted to become. Not perfect, but better. Not blind to his privilege, but working to use it for something beyond his own advancement. Not someone who waited to be impressed before offering basic human respect, but someone who saw people clearly from the beginning. It was a long road ahead, and he'd stumbled plenty of times. But at least now he knew which direction to walk. At least now he understood what had been missing all along. 6 months later, spring arrived in New York with the kind of aggressive optimism that made even jaded Manhattanites believe in renewal. Cherry blossoms erupted in Central Park. Tourists flooded the streets with cameras and questions, and the city shed its winter gray like old skin, revealing something brighter underneath. Javier stood in Hartwell and Stone's main conference room, watching the final signatures go onto the Nakamura deal. It had taken months longer than originally planned, required complete restructuring of the firm's approach to corporate social responsibility, and demanded more internal changes than anyone had anticipated. But it was finally happening. Kenji Nakamura signed with the same deliberate precision he brought to everything, then looked up at Javier with something that might have been approval. "Your firm has changed," he said quietly. "The culture feels different than it did 6 months ago." "We're trying," Javier said, echoing the words he'd said so many times they'd become a kind of mantra. "We still have a long way to go, but we're trying." "That is all anyone can ask," Kenji said. "Continuous improvement, not perfection. This is the Japanese way." After the signing, after the handshakes and the champagne and the carefully staged photos for the firm's website, Javier found himself alone in his office as evening settled over the city. He'd made senior partner 3 months ago, the youngest in the firm's history to achieve that status, and the victory felt both earned and hollow. He'd gotten what he wanted. He just wasn't sure anymore if it was what he needed. His phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Chen. "Don't forget about tomorrow, 2 p.m., Community Legal Center on Amsterdam. Nora's expecting you." Javier smiled, saved the reminder, and tried not to feel nervous about what tomorrow would bring. The Community Legal Center occupied a converted brownstone in a neighborhood where lawyers in $1,000 suits didn't typically venture. The waiting room was full of people who looked tired and worried and grateful that someone was willing to help them navigate systems designed to be deliberately incomprehensible. Javier arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in jeans and a button-down instead of his usual suit, and felt ridiculously out of place anyway. "You must be Javier Rivas." A young woman with kind eyes and an NYU law sweatshirt appeared from a back office. "I'm Sarah Kim, one of the staff attorneys. Nora's in the conference room setting up. She said to send you back when you arrived." Javier followed her down a narrow hallway lined with filing cabinets and motivational posters about knowing your rights. The conference room was small, cramped, with a table that had seen better decades and chairs that didn't quite match. And there was Nora, arranging folders with the same methodical precision she'd once brought to organizing his case files. She looked different than he remembered, lighter somehow, like she'd shed weight that had nothing to do with pounds and everything to do with expectation. She wore jeans and a simple blue sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, no makeup that he could see. She looked young and real and completely comfortable in a way he'd never seen her look at Hartwell and Stone. "Hi," she said, looking up with a smile that was genuine and unguarded. "Thanks for coming. I wasn't sure you actually would." "I said I would," Javier replied, surprised by how much he'd wanted to be here, how much he'd been looking forward to this moment. "People say a lot of things," Nora said. "Following through is different." She gestured to the folders spread across the table. "This is the program I told you about. We're calling it the Legal Dignity Project. Free legal services for people who've been victimized by employment discrimination, workplace harassment, wage theft. The stuff that happens to people who don't have resources to fight back." "Margaret mentioned you're funding it through your consulting work," Javier said, sitting down across from her. "Partially," Nora confirmed. "The Nakamura CSR initiative is generating enough income that I can afford to do this on the side. And Etienne Marceau's foundation provided seed funding. But we need more resources, more lawyers willing to donate time, more support staff, more everything, basically." She pushed one of the folders toward him. "I'm not asking Hartwell and Stone for money," she said carefully. "I know how that would look, like I'm leveraging the Nakamura relationship for personal projects. but I'm asking if the firm might be willing to participate in a pro bono partnership. Your associates get real experience, our clients get quality representation. Everyone benefits. Javier opened the folder and found himself looking at case summaries that made his chest tight. A housekeeper fired after reporting sexual harassment. A construction worker who hadn't been paid for 3 months of work. A retail employee terminated for taking sick leave after a cancer diagnosis. These were the people who fell through cracks in systems designed by people like him, for people like him. These cases are solid, he said, scanning the legal issues. Winnable, most of them. Why aren't these people getting representation? Because they can't afford it, Nora said simply. Because most lawyers won't take cases on contingency if the damages aren't big enough to justify the time investment. Because our legal system is built to serve people with resources, and everyone else just has to hope for mercy. That's pretty cynical, Javier observed. That's pretty accurate, Nora corrected. I've been doing this work for 4 months now, and the stories I hear every day would break your heart if you let them. People who did everything right, who worked hard and followed rules, and still got destroyed by employers who knew they didn't have the power to fight back. She leaned forward, and Javier could see the passion burning in her eyes, the same fire that had built literacy programs in Eastern Europe, the same determination that had carried her through grief and rebuilding. I can't change the whole system, she said, but I can help individual people get justice. And if I can get law firms like Hartwell and Stone to contribute resources, we can help more people. We can start shifting the culture so that exploitation has consequences. Oh, you want me to pitch this to Richard, Javier said, understanding dawning. I want you to champion it, Nora said. As a senior partner, you have influence now. Use it for something that matters. Richard's going to want to know what's in it for the firm, Javier said. He thinks in terms of business development, client relationships, competitive positioning. Then tell him it's good for recruitment, Nora said. Tell him young lawyers want to work places that have values beyond profit. Tell him it's good PR, good for the firm's reputation, good for morale. Tell him whatever you need to tell him, but get him to say yes. Javier looked at her across the scarred conference table. This woman who'd been invisible until she chose to be seen, who'd walked away from his world and built something better in a cramped brownstone with mismatched chairs. Why do you trust me with this? He asked. After everything that happened, after how I treated you. Nora was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Because you changed, she said finally. I've been watching from a distance. Rosa tells me things. Margaret tells me things. And I read your articles. What articles? Javier asked, confused. The op-ed in the legal journal about implicit bias in law firms, Nora said. The panel discussion you did at Columbia about privilege and professional responsibility. The memo you sent to all Hartwell and Stone partners about reforming how the firm evaluates and compensates support staff. You've been doing the work, Javier, not perfectly, but consistently. That matters. Javier felt heat rise in his face. He'd been writing and speaking more, trying to use his platform to push conversations about equity and dignity in professional spaces. But he hadn't realized Nora was paying attention, hadn't known his efforts were visible to her. I'm trying to be better, he said. Like you told me to. I know, Nora said softly, and I'm proud of you for it. That's why I'm asking you to do this, because I think you actually care now. Not just about looking good or feeling better about yourself, but about actually making things different for people who need the system to work for them. Before Javier could respond, the door opened and a young woman entered, late 20s, with dark curly hair and the same gray eyes that looked so familiar, it took Javier a moment to make the connection. Maya, Nora said, standing to hug the newcomer. Perfect timing. Javier, this is my sister Maya. She just finished her MSW, and she's running the client services side of the project. Maya shook Javier's hand with a grip that suggested she'd heard stories about him and wasn't entirely impressed. So you're the lawyer who invited my sister to that gala as a joke, she said bluntly. Nora says you've changed. I'm reserving judgment. That's fair, Javier said, liking her immediately despite the obvious skepticism. Maya's brilliant at connecting clients with resources beyond just legal services, Nora explained. A lot of our people need help with housing, healthcare access, food security. Legal problems don't exist in isolation. They spent the next 2 hours going through the program structure, reviewing case examples, discussing what a partnership with Hartwell and Stone might look like. Maya brought coffee from a bodega down the street, nothing like the artisanal espresso Javier was used to, but somehow better for being simple and unpretentious. As they talked, Javier found himself drawn into the vision Nora was building. It wasn't just about winning cases or getting settlements. It was about restoring dignity to people who'd been treated as disposable, about proving that the legal system could work for everyone, not just those who could afford to make it work. "I'll pitch it to Richard on Monday," Javier said finally. "I can't guarantee he'll say yes, but I'll make the case as strongly as I can." "That's all I'm asking," Nora said. As the meeting wound down and Maya excused herself to meet with a new client, Javier found himself alone with Nora in the small conference room. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, turning the shabby space golden. "Can I ask you something personal?" Javier said. "You can ask," Nora said. "I might not answer." "Are you happy?" Javier asked. "Really happy. Not just professionally successful, but actually content with where you are and what you're doing?" Nora considered the question seriously, her eyes distant as she thought. "I'm getting there," she said finally. "For a long time after Marcus died, I thought happiness was something that had died with him, that I'd spend the rest of my life just surviving, just getting through days without falling apart completely." She looked around the conference room, at the mismatched chairs and the coffee-stained table and the filing cabinet stuffed with other people's pain. "But this work, this project, helping people who need someone to fight for them, it makes me feel useful again. Important in a way that has nothing to do with impressive credentials or recognition. And that feels like the beginning of happiness. Like maybe I can build something meaningful from the wreckage of everything I lost." "He'd be proud of you," Javier said quietly. "Marcus, if he could see what you're building here." Nora's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I think so too," she said. "I think he'd love that I'm using everything he taught me about fighting for people who can't fight for themselves. He was always better at that than I was, seeing the human cost of systemic injustice, caring about individuals rather than just programs and policies." "You're pretty good at it now," Javier observed. "I learned from the best," Nora said, "and from the worst, honestly. Watching how people at Hartwell and Stone treated me when they thought I was nobody important, that taught me a lot about how power works and who it serves." "I'm sorry," Javier said, and meant it in ways that went deeper than words, "for being part of that, for not seeing you." "I know," Nora said, "and I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, necessarily, but because holding on to anger takes energy. I'd rather spend building something positive." They walked out together into the spring evening, and Javier noticed how different this neighborhood felt from the gleaming towers of Midtown Manhattan. Here, people sat on stoops and talked to neighbors. Children played on sidewalks while parents watched from windows. Life happened visibly, communally, without the isolation that came from luxury high-rises and private car services. "You want to grab dinner?" Nora asked as they stood on the sidewalk. "There's a good Vietnamese place 2 blocks over. Nothing fancy, but the pho will change your life." "I'd like that," Javier said, surprised by how much he meant it. They walked through the neighborhood as evening settled over the city, and Nora pointed out landmarks that mattered to this community. The community garden where local families grew vegetables, the library that ran after-school programs, the bodega owned by a family who'd lived here for 3 generations. These were the kind of details Javier had never noticed, had never thought to notice, because his Manhattan existed in a different dimension where neighborhoods were just addresses and communities were just real estate values. The restaurant was small, crowded, deliciously unpretentious. They squeezed into a corner table and ordered from a menu that was half in Vietnamese and half in approximated English. When the food came, Javier understood what Nora had meant about the pho changing his life. It was layered and complex and utterly unlike anything he'd eaten in restaurants where the decor cost more than the meal. "So tell me honestly," Nora said, blowing on her spoon to cool the broth. "What's it like being senior partner? Is it everything you wanted?" Javier thought about the question, about the corner office and the equity stake and the nameplate that announced his status. "It's weird," he admitted. "I spent years working toward that goal, convinced it would mean I'd made it, that I'd finally be someone important. And then I got it, and it just felt like more responsibility without the satisfaction I expected." Because the work itself isn't fulfilling, Nora said, not unkindly. You're good at it, sure. But it doesn't feed whatever part of you needs to feel like you're contributing something meaningful to the world. When did you get so wise? Javier asked. When I lost everything and had to figure out what actually mattered, Nora said. Turns out crisis is a pretty good teacher if you're willing to learn. They talked through dinner about everything and nothing. Nora's plans to expand the Legal Dignity Project to other cities. Javier's efforts to reform hiring and promotion practices at Hartwell and Stone, whether they'd both watched the same documentary about corporate malfeasance. It was easy, comfortable, the kind of conversation that happened between people who'd moved past their worst moments with each other and found something genuine on the other side. When they finally left the restaurant, the city had settled into its nighttime rhythm, traffic still heavy but moving faster, lights brighter against the darkness. The air carrying that particular New York energy that suggested anything was possible if you were brave enough to reach for it. Thanks for coming today, Nora said as they stood at the subway entrance, and for being willing to champion the project. It means a lot that you're using your position for something beyond just advancing your own career. Thanks for giving me the chance, Javier said, for believing I could be better even when I gave you plenty of evidence to the contrary. Nora smiled, started down the subway stairs, then paused and turned back. Javier, we're going to be okay, I think, both of us. Different than we expected, different than we planned. But okay. Yeah, Javier agreed, feeling the truth of it settle in his chest. I think we are. Monday morning, Javier walked into Richard Hartwell's office with Nora's proposal and a determination to make this happen regardless of what obstacles the managing partner threw up. But he'd underestimated how much the firm had changed in 6 months and how much Richard himself had been affected by the Nakamura situation. A pro bono partnership with Nora's legal aid project, Richard said, reading through the proposal with sharp eyes. You realize this is going to cost us significant associate hours with no billable revenue. Yes, Javier said, but it's also going to make us attractive to the kind of young lawyers who want to work somewhere with actual values. And it's going to give our associates real courtroom experience they wouldn't get otherwise. Plus, frankly, it's the right thing to do. Richard looked at him over the top of his reading glasses. Since when do you care about the right thing to do? Since I watched us almost destroy someone extraordinary because we were too blind to see past our own assumptions, Javier said bluntly. Since I realized that being successful in law doesn't mean anything if we're just helping rich people get richer while everyone else gets crushed by systems we've designed to exclude them. You sound like Nora, Richard observed. I'll take that as a compliment, Javier said. Richard set down the proposal and leaned back in his chair, studying Javier with an expression that was hard to read. Margaret's been pushing for something like this for years, he said finally. Pro bono work that actually matters, not just the corporate board service we count toward our annual requirements. I've been resistant because I couldn't see the business case. And now? Javier asked. Now we lost a major client because our internal culture was toxic enough to sabotage our own deal, Richard said. Now we're competing for talent with firms that actually give a damn about social responsibility. Now I'm getting close to retirement and thinking about legacy, about what this firm stands for beyond just making money. He picked up the proposal again, flipped through it more slowly. All right, he said, we'll pilot it. 6-month trial, 10 associates, committed to minimum 20 hours per month. But Javier, you're overseeing this personally. If it works, it's a model we can expand. If it fails, it's on you. I'll take that responsibility, Javier said, feeling something like joy unfurl in his chest. The program launched quietly a month later. 10 associates volunteered immediately, mostly younger lawyers who'd been looking for exactly this kind of opportunity, but also a few mid-level attorneys who were tired of the moral compromise inherent in corporate law and wanted to feel like their skills mattered for something beyond quarterly earnings. Javier spent 2 evenings a week at the Community Legal Center, working alongside Nora and her team, taking cases that made him furious and heartbroken and more determined than ever to make the system work for everyone, not just those who could afford to make it work. He won his first case in August, a wage theft claim for a restaurant worker who'd been paid below minimum wage for 3 years. The settlement was modest by corporate standards, barely $15,000. But watching his client cry with relief and gratitude, knowing that money would cover rent and groceries and maybe a little breathing room, meant more than any multi-million-dollar deal he'd ever closed. You're getting good at this, Nora said afterward, as they packed up case files in the conference room. The associates tell me you're patient with them, good at teaching, willing to let them take the lead even when you could do it faster yourself. I learned from watching you, Javier said, how you were always teaching without making it obvious, how you created space for people to learn instead of just doing everything yourself. I never taught you anything, Nora protested. You taught me everything that matters, Javier said quietly. About dignity and resilience and what it looks like to rebuild yourself after everything falls apart. About using whatever power you have to help people instead of just advancing yourself. About being brave enough to be seen even when it would be safer to stay hidden. Nora was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. Marcus would have liked you, she said. The you you're becoming, I mean. He always believed people could change if they wanted to badly enough. I was more cynical, but you're proving him right. I wish I could have met him, Javier said honestly. He sounds like someone worth knowing. He was, Nora said softly. He was the best person I've ever known, and losing him almost destroyed me. But I think maybe I'm finally at a place where I can remember him without the grief overwhelming everything else, where I can be grateful for what we had instead of just devastated by what I lost. She wiped at her eyes, smiled despite the tears. And I think I'm ready to start building a life that's mine, not just a memorial to him. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Javier said. Over the following months, the Legal Dignity Project grew beyond anyone's initial expectations. The partnership with Hartwell and Stone attracted attention from other firms, and by December, 5 more major law practices had signed on to provide pro bono support. The cases they won created precedents that protected other workers, established accountability for employers who'd operated with impunity, and started shifting the culture around whose rights mattered and whose didn't. Nora's consulting practice thrived alongside the legal aid work. The Nakamura Corporation's CSR initiative became a model for other companies, and Etienne Marceau's foundation funded expansion of the literacy programs she'd built in Eastern Europe. She was traveling again, speaking at conferences, consulting with governments and NGOs, doing the work she'd been born to do, but with the hard-won wisdom that came from surviving genuine loss. And slowly, carefully, she and Javier built something that looked like real friendship. Not romance. They were too different, their histories too complicated, their professional lives too intertwined, but genuine connection, built on mutual respect and shared values and the understanding that both of them were works in progress, trying to be better than they'd been. Maya joined them often for dinners or weekend volunteering at community events. She was sharp and funny and ruthlessly honest in ways that kept both Nora and Javier grounded when they started taking themselves too seriously. She'd become the project's heart, the person who saw clients as whole human beings rather than just legal problems to solve, who connected people with resources that went beyond courtrooms and settlements. One evening in late November, the 3 of them sat in the now familiar Vietnamese restaurant, celebrating a major victory, a class action settlement that would provide back wages to over 300 construction workers who'd been systematically underpaid for years. The settlement was significant enough to make the news, to send a message to other employers that exploitation had consequences. We should make a toast, Maya said, raising her beer, to justice, to persistence, and to my sister for building something that actually matters. To Nora, Javier echoed, raising his own glass. To all of us, Nora corrected. This isn't my project anymore, it's ours. Everyone who's contributed time and energy and skill to make it work. That's what makes it sustainable. It's not dependent on any one person. It's built on collective effort and shared values. They drank to that, and Javier felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for as long as he could remember. This was what success was supposed to feel like, not corner offices or name recognition or impressive titles, but knowing you'd contributed something meaningful to making the world slightly less cruel. Later, as they walked through the neighborhood toward the subway, Nora fell into step beside Javier while Maya walked ahead, texting someone and laughing at their responses. She's dating someone, Nora said, noticing Javier's curious look. A social worker she met through the project. It's new, but it seems good. I'm happy for her. What about you? Javier asked. Are you dating anyone? Nora smiled. Not right now. I'm still figuring out who I am without defining myself in relation to someone else. After Marcus, after years of building our life together, and then having to rebuild alone, I need to know I can be complete on my own before I'm ready to share my life with someone new. That's wise, Javier said. That's therapy, Nora corrected with a laugh. I've been doing a lot of it. Turns out grief doesn't have a timeline, and trying to rush through it just makes it last longer.
Just a bit.
They reached the subway entrance where their paths would diverge, Nora heading to Brooklyn, Javier to his apartment uptown. But before they parted, Nora touched his arm gently. I want you to know something, she said. When you invited me to that gala, when Camilla was being cruel and you were being thoughtless, I was so angry. Angrier than I'd been since Marcus died, because at least grief made sense. What you all did just felt gratuitous, unnecessary cruelty for entertainment. Nora, Let me finish, she said gently. I was angry, but I'm not anymore. Because that night, that whole horrible situation, it forced me to remember who I was before grief made me small. It pushed me to be brave again, to claim space again, to build something that mattered instead of just surviving. So in a weird way, thank you. For the invitation, for the catalyst, for giving me a reason to fight back. I don't deserve your thanks, Javier said quietly. I deserve your anger. Maybe, Nora said. But I'm choosing gratitude anyway, because anger is exhausting, and life is short, and I've already wasted too much time on feelings that don't serve me. She hugged him then, a real hug, and Javier felt the weight of forgiveness settle over him like grace he hadn't earned but desperately needed. See you Tuesday, Nora said, pulling back with a smile. We've got that housing discrimination case to prep. Tuesday, Javier confirmed and watched her disappear down the subway stairs before turning toward his own rote home. A year after the gala that changed everything, Hartwell and Stone hosted an event celebrating the Legal Dignity Project's expansion. They'd helped over 500 clients, won millions in settlements and back wages, and created legal precedents that protected thousands more workers across New York. Other cities were launching similar programs, and law schools were teaching the model as an example of how private firms could contribute meaningfully to access to justice. The event was held at the Metropolitan Club, the same venue where Nora had walked in wearing crimson silk and quiet determination, where everything had started to shift. But this time, she wasn't the outsider granted grudging admission. She was the guest of honor, invited to speak about the project's impact and vision for the future. Javier stood at the back of the ballroom watching her address the crowd. Lawyers and clients and community organizers and everyone who'd contributed to building something that mattered. She wore the same red dress, he noticed, and wondered if that was intentional or just practicality. She spoke without notes, her voice clear and strong, about dignity and justice and the responsibility that came with legal training. She talked about her own journey, the work she'd done before, the loss she'd survived, the decision to rebuild by helping others who'd been dismissed and discarded by systems designed to exclude them. And she challenged everyone in that room to examine their own practices, their own assumptions about who deserved quality representation and who didn't. She was diplomatic but direct, kind but unflinching, and Javier watched the faces around him shift from polite attention to genuine engagement as her words landed. When she finished, the applause was thunderous, real, earned, nothing like the polite recognition that usually followed speeches at events like this. Richard Hartwell took the microphone next and announced that Hartwell and Stone was committing to permanent funding for the Legal Dignity Project, was expanding the pro bono partnership, and was creating an endowed fellowship in Marcus Chen's name to support young lawyers who wanted to do public interest work. Margaret Chen, sitting in the front row, was openly crying. Nora found her afterward, and they held each other for a long moment while the crowd respectfully gave them space to grieve and celebrate the brother and son and fiancé they'd both lost. As the evening wound down and guests began to filter out into the spring night, Javier found Nora on the same terrace where they'd stood a year ago, where she'd explained her history and he'd begun to understand the depths of his own blindness. "You were brilliant," he said, joining her at the railing. "Marcus would have been so proud." "I hope so," Nora said softly. "I hope wherever he is, he knows that his work didn't die with him, that what he believed in is still happening, still growing, still making a difference." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out at the city lights. Then Nora turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about what comes next," she said. "The project is sustainable now. It doesn't need me managing every detail. And I've been offered a position, Director of International Programs for Etienne Marceau's foundation. It would mean travel, big picture strategy, building programs in multiple countries." "That sounds amazing," Javier said, genuinely happy for her despite the selfish wish that she'd stay close. "Are you going to take it?" "I think so," Nora said. "But I wanted to ask you something first. The project needs a new director, someone who understands both the legal and social service sides, someone who can work with law firms and community organizations, someone who's learned how to see people clearly and fight for what matters." She smiled at his expression. "I'm offering you the job, Javier, part-time, alongside your work at Hartwell and Stone. I can't pay you what you make as senior partner, but I can offer you the chance to build something meaningful with your life, to use your privilege and training and connections for people who genuinely need them." Javier felt his heart rate accelerate, felt possibility opening up in front of him like a door he'd been looking for without knowing it existed. "You want me to run the Legal Dignity Project?" "I want you to lead it into whatever it becomes next," Nora said. "You've proven you can do the work. You've proven you're willing to examine your own privilege and use it constructively. And you've proven you care enough to keep trying even when it's uncomfortable. That's what the project needs. Not perfection, but commitment to continuous growth." "Yes," Javier said, not letting himself overthink it, not letting doubt creep in to sabotage possibility. "Yes, I want to do this." Nora's smile was radiant. "Good," she said, "because you're the only person I trust with it, the only person who understands what it costs to build and what it means to keep it going." They shook hands formally, then laughed at the absurdity of such a gesture between friends who'd been through so much together. And as they stood on that terrace, where everything had started to change a year ago, Javier felt like he could finally see the shape of his life clearly. Not the life he'd planned, but the one he'd stumbled into through failure and recognition, and the grace of someone who'd chosen to believe he could be better. 6 months later, Javier stood in the same cramped conference room where he'd first really talked with Nora about the Legal Dignity Project. But now the walls were covered with photos of clients they'd helped, cases they'd won, lives they'd changed. The mismatched chairs had been replaced with better ones, donated by a furniture company after they'd won a wage theft case against one of their competitors. Maya stuck her head in the door. "We've got 3 new intake appointments this afternoon," she said. "And that journalist from NPR wants to interview you about the fellowship program. Also, someone brought donuts, the good kind from the Polish bakery." "Be right there," Javier said, finishing his notes on a case he was preparing for trial next week. His phone buzzed with a text from Nora, who was somewhere in East Africa building a literacy program with Etienne Marceau's foundation. "Saw the news about the Supreme Court cert petition. Congratulations on getting that far. Change takes time, but you're building something that will outlast all of us." Javier smiled, typed back a quick response, then gathered his materials and headed toward the main office space where clients were waiting and work that mattered was piling up in the best possible way. He'd stepped down from senior partner at Hartwell and Stone, keeping a part-time consulting role that paid enough to cover his reduced expenses but freed him to focus on the Legal Dignity Project. His apartment had gotten smaller, his wardrobe simpler, his life less about impressing people and more about actually connecting with them. And he was happier than he'd ever been in the corner office, happier than he'd been chasing partnership or closing deals or climbing ladders that led nowhere worth going. That evening, after the last client meeting and the final case review and the cleanup that everyone shared because hierarchy here meant something different than it had at Hartwell and Stone, Javier walked home through the neighborhood he'd come to love. He stopped at the bodega where the owner knew his name, grabbed coffee at the Vietnamese restaurant where he and Nora had shared so many meals, waved to neighbors who were sitting on their stoops watching the world go by. This was his community now. These were his people. And the work he did mattered to them in concrete, measurable ways. Rent paid, wages recovered, dignity restored. His phone rang with a FaceTime call from Nora. When he answered, her face filled the screen, tanned and happy, with what looked like a village school in the background. "How's Africa?" he asked. "Incredible," she said, her smile bright enough to cross continents. "We just opened our 5th literacy center. And Javier, you should see these people. Grandmothers learning to read alongside their grandchildren. Men who've spent their whole lives ashamed they couldn't read contracts or signs. It's exactly the work Marcus and I dreamed of doing together. I'm so happy for you, Javier said, and meant it completely. How's the project? Nora asked. Growing, Javier said. We've got 8 law firms participating now. Maya's talking about expanding to Boston, and that Supreme Court case might actually get heard, which would set precedent nationally for wage theft accountability. You're amazing, Nora said. You know that, right? You took something I started and made it bigger and better than I could have imagined. I learned from the best, Javier said. From someone who taught me that the most important thing you can do with privilege is use it to help people who don't have it. That success means nothing if it's only about yourself. They talked for another 20 minutes about cases and programs and the small victories that added up to systemic change. Then Nora had to go. Another meeting, another opportunity to build something that mattered. Before she hung up, she said, Javier, thank you for becoming someone worth knowing, for proving that people really can change if they're willing to do the work. Thank you, Javier said, for not giving up on me, for seeing something worth saving even when I couldn't see it myself. After the call ended, Javier sat in his small apartment with its view of other people's windows and its furniture from IKEA and its walls covered with photos of clients and colleagues and communities he'd become part of. This life looked nothing like the one he'd imagined when he'd graduated from Harvard Law, when he'd accepted the job at Hartwell and Stone, when he'd thought success meant corner offices and impressive titles. But it was his, built from failure and recognition and the grace of second chances, built on relationships that mattered and work that changed lives and the daily choice to be better than he'd been yesterday. Somewhere across the ocean, Nora was building literacy programs and remembering a love she'd lost while creating new meaning from that grief. Somewhere in this city, Maya was probably still at the office, making sure tomorrow's clients would be welcomed with dignity and care. Somewhere in law schools and firms and communities across the country, people were learning that justice wasn't just for those who could afford it, that systems could change if enough people demanded it, that one person's decision to be better could ripple outward in ways impossible to measure. And in a small apartment in a neighborhood he'd once never visited, Javier Rivas sat with a cup of bodega coffee and a case file that would help a single mother recover stolen wages, and felt richer than he'd ever felt in the corner office at Hartwell and Stone. Because wealth, he'd learned, wasn't about what you accumulated. It was about what you gave. And he was finally giving something that mattered. The window across the street showed a family having dinner together, their laughter visible even through the glass. Below, the bodega owner was closing up shop, calling goodnight to neighbors who called back. A bus rumbled past, carrying people home from work that paid too little and demanded too much. These were the people Javier fought for now. These were the lives he was learning to see clearly, to value completely, to serve with everything he'd once reserved for corporate clients and quarterly earnings. And tomorrow, he'd wake up and do it again. Not perfectly, but persistently. Not because it made him impressive, but because it made him whole. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything.